Hello everyone, Editing Isla here, and I wanted to give you two quick notes before we start the episode. One is that this episode wound up containing a very in-depth discussion of weight, fatness, fat phobia, and fat shaming. I wanted to let you know that just in case anyone is not in the mood for that conversation today. The other thing I wanted to let everyone know is that I actually recorded this episode over 3 to 4 recording sessions, and you can hear that a couple times throughout. The quality of the audio shifts just slightly, and just wanted to let you know that's what's going on. Thank you, and if you're sticking around, I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome back to Emotional Justice, the podcast where I examine some of my favorite romance novels with the lens of emotional justice. I'm Isla Faye, a lifelong romance reader. I also believe that the romance genre shapes how we understand love, who gets it, what it looks like, and what we're told we have to survive to be worthy of it. I started this podcast because I truly believe that romance can be a radical tool, one that reveals the emotional patterns that we normalize, the power imbalances that we mistake for passion, and the deep, often invisible work of healing. So each episode examines a different book using the framework of emotional justice, which is a way of recognizing, addressing, and repairing emotional harm, particularly for people who've been marginalized, dismissed, or denied full humanity. Some of the questions that I ask of the books that we look at are emotional wounds acknowledged and repaired? Is harm confronted and not just forgiven? And can love be a place where both people are seen, safe, and free? Because in this space, I believe that love isn't just a plot point, it can be an act of justice. In this episode, we're unpacking Audited by the Anubis by Wendi Guff, and this is a romance that mixes monster mates and generational trauma. I only read this book about a year ago. I fully admit I picked it because of the cover. It was such a cozy read that I immediately actually reread it, and I chose it for this podcast because I found the differences between Anu, the main male character, and Edward from the Raven Prince to be fascinating. If you haven't listened to that episode, Edward in the Raven Prince is the definition of a man-child, while Anu, who is not a man, is emotional maturity incarnate. Before we dive in, a quick note on the structure of this podcast. So each episode has two main parts. First, a full in-depth summary of the book, spoilers and all, followed by a thematic analysis through the lens of emotional justice. I include the summary because I want every listener to be able to follow the conversation, whether you've read the book or not. But that does mean major spoilers ahead. So if Audited by the Anubis is already on your TBR and you want to experience the story firsthand, you've got a couple options. First, you can pause here and go read it and then come back. You can completely skip this episode for now and circle back around, or you can stay with me and I'll tell you the story. A little bit about the book before we get started. So the main genre would fall into contemporary / paranormal or monster romance with a little bit of soft dom sub dynamics, fated mate. A couple of trigger warnings just here at the top. There's gaslighting and emotional manipulation by parent. There is body shaming language. There is one of the big themes in the book is around ableism and particularly surrounding dyslexia. There's references to marital emotional abuse. There's some very light, non-consensual, magical bonding that is definitely addressed repeatedly. It's not just something that happens. The author does unpack it. There is some gun violence. There is very open door scenes. For those of you who maybe don't know what an open door scene is that's when the reader is standing at the bedroom door and gets to see everything. There are a couple of kink elements, including very consensual dominant sub dynamics. The main male character is a monster, so if you've never heard of nodding, we do have some nodding involved. We have a bit of a breeding kink, and I think it's all of the housekeeping stuff taken care of. Let's go ahead and jump in now for the summary of Audited by the Anubis. So the book begins with Fern Mabin at home, taking the day off from work from her bakery, and she's just hanging out on the couch and she's rewatching Bridgerton, and she's also eating cookies that she herself has baked. She's reflecting on how much she's loving the romance. She also thinks to herself one marriage was enough for her. So while she's sitting there and enjoying herself, someone knocks at her door. She decides, I'm just going to ignore it. Today's my day off, but they keep knocking. She finally gets up after it becomes apparent that whoever's knocking at the door is not going to leave. As she walks across the living room, we get a little bit of a description of her. She's this cute little package with short red hair, a little button nose and stuff. So she looks through the peephole and she's shocked to find that it's an Anubis on the other side. Fern mentally describes the Anubis as tall, dark, and handsome, but she quickly amends it to tall, dark, and deadly, which immediately points to Fern feelings towards seeing a monster on the other side of the door. She's not totally freaked out. She's a little bit intrigued. She goes on to further mentally describe him as having soulful eyes, which are lined with seemingly gold eyeliner. And she describes his suit and thinks a lot of thoughts that are a little bit plot dumping, which is great because we're entering a whole new fantasy world where it's clear monsters and humans, they live side by side. She thinks to herself that it's said that Anubis are actually descended from the ancient Egyptian god of death. She kind of has a thought to herself, well, he's definitely descended from a god of something. Apparently she has been standing at the door long enough looking at him because finally the Anubis from the other side says, ma'am, do you mind opening the door? Which startles Fern from her reverie and she falls backwards and is, nobody's home. Immediately she knows how silly that sounds, so after a second she thinks, oh, he's probably just here to try to convert me to his god. I'm just gonna open the door, tell him to go away. But as soon as she opens the door, the Anubis introduces himself and he says, I am Anu Appa, and I'm from the IRS, the actual government IRS. That was the last thing that Fern expected. She opens the door more fully to engage with him, asking, oh my gosh, hi, is there something wrong with my taxes? Why are you here? Anu explains that she's being audited and that he will be her monster auditor. And she's very confused and kerfuffled. So she says, please come inside, let's talk some more. Anu's very tall. He has to duck his head to enter her house. And Fern is finding herself internally confused about where her nervousness is coming from. Is this because she's a business owner who's being audited, or is it just from his mere presence, which she finds is having like a noticeable physical effect? But she stands on politeness. She offers him some tea, which he accepts, and then lifts his nose and sniffs and oh, are those cookies I smell? Which Fern blushes and bright red, and she says, yes, but I ate them all. And she braces for impact, waiting for him to say something really rude about her eating a bunch of cookies all by herself. But he doesn't. In fact, what he says is that, wow, if they tasted as good as they smell, then, well, I understand why you ate them all. And this is our first hint at readers that Fern is dealing with some insecurities about her weight. In fact, what she says is that she's aware that she's thicker than she should be, which is something that her ex-husband constantly berated her for. So we now have a picture of Fern, who is someone who has not had a healthy, happy relationship in the past. And just by his very simple comment, Anu has already set himself apart from her ex. In fact, Fern can't fully process what he said because she thinks back about how for the last 5 years, she's been subjected to every cruel comment that a partner can say to their loved one, but that Anu's words make her want to turn into mush. So Fern says, please settle on the couch. I'm gonna go get you some tea. She realizes she's shaking and she thinks it's because she's just on edge because he didn't immediately call her a fat cow. She brings him his tea and he says, I usually go by Mr. Napa, but please call me Anu. And she goes, well, only if you call me Fern. And he hesitates for a minute before he says, well, if it's just the two of us, which sets her heart racing. Fern tries to stay focused and she asks, am I in trouble because my taxes? And before Anu answers, he has taken a sip of her tea and he compliments her. And Fern's like, I'm so glad you like it. Am I in trouble? And Anu says, this is just a routine procedure for the IRS. And he asks her, did you receive the letters that the IRS has already sent? Fern feels really sick inside, but we, the reader, we don't know why she's having this really intense physical reaction to him asking about these letters. And then she admits, I don't actually handle my taxes. That's my mom who does that. And she mentally thinks to herself, along with other things, quote unquote. Anu thinks about this for a second, and then he pulls out these little glasses to read from a paper to Fern, and Fern blurts out, oh my gosh, those are so cute. You're so cute. Then blushes and it's, I can't believe I just said that. And Anu smiles, and says, he just accepts it. And he's like, I think they make me look like an old man. To which Fern thinks that nothing could be further from the truth and that she thinks he looks like a nerdy sex god. But keeping them on track, Anu asks if Fern's mother has always done her taxes because according to her paperwork, it's Fern that's signing it and saying, I'm the one that does it. And Fern explains that her mother is her business manager, always files her taxes for her. She didn't realize it would be this big of a problem. And Fern realizes she's kind of been babbling, so she trails off and like, wow, I must sound like an idiot to you. And he goes on to say, no, you're not an idiot. You know, you're running a small business. It's very difficult. There's lots of rules that can be overlooked. And, you know, it probably never even occurred to you or your mom that your mother shouldn't be doing your taxes because she's not a legal tax preparation company. Can we talk about how kind Anu is right off the bat? Anyways, Fern is starting to feel a little bit better about the audit until Anu says that the reason she has been flagged for an audit is because her taxes have not actually been filed for 2 years. at which point Fern just starts laughing with hysteria, which I feel like is a reasonable response. Excusing herself, Fern goes to make a phone call, but she first detours to the bathroom to throw up. The book switches to Anu's point of view, and something that this book does that I don't think I've seen other duets do is that as it switches back and forth between the points of view, especially in the early chapters, the book will actually rewind itself several pages and show the exact same events that we just read, but from the other character's point of view. So we're now going to see everything that just happened, but from Anu's point of view, showing up at Fern's door. He's driving to Fern's house and he's admiring how cute the town is. He's thinking to himself that he spends most of the year doing audits for the IRS, living on the road, and he only has about 3 more audits before he can finally return home. He's plot dumping for us, thank goodness. So he's giving the backstory that he's a monster, he's been working for the IRS, and this is both a blessing and a curse, because having a monster show up to do an audit will definitely make some people comply more easily, but it also freaks out a bunch of people. So for example, apparently one woman thought he was there to mummify her, which is very cute. He also is thinking about how he drives an electric car because he wants to cut down on Earth's carbon footprint, which all of this mental backstory and thought, what it made me think was that this guy might be an Egyptian jackal, but he's giving full-blown golden retriever vibes all over the place. So then he gets out, he knocks on Fern's door, he can hear the TV, he can hear her talking to herself because he has this excellent monster hearing. And from his point of view, when she opens the door, Anu's first thought is that she's absolutely stunning, and he specifically describes her as mouth-watering. And despite his professional demeanor, he feels lust hammering in his body, especially when she invites him in, and he finds as she steps forward to lead him into the house that he's ogling her butt, and he's, oh my gosh, I gotta stop, be professional. Like all this heat running through his body, and he reminds himself that IRS employees do not check out their auditees' butts. So as I just mentioned, the book is going to go back and forth, but it also adds dialogue that wasn't in the previous chapter. So now we get this piece of dialogue that Fern didn't actually say in the first chapter, which is Fern saying, wow, I never imagined that an IRS auditor would be like you. And Anu asks, well, how did you imagine them being? Which Fern says, I didn't think they would be so good looking. Anu takes a moment to reflect with a relief because she's apparently not speciesist against his kind, which is something that happens in this world, and he's also a little glad that she finds him attractive. The scene then replays a little bit of the dialogue that we previously saw, adding in that Anu is very aroused by her scent. He is having this extreme physical reaction in his own body, and he's down boy. Just like in the previous chapter, Fern excuses herself to go make a phone call. Anu is thankful for the little bit of distance because he is having this waves of lust. He thinks to himself, wow, if I didn't know any better, I think I'm going into a rut, which I have to admit is kind of one of my all-time favorite tropes in romance novels, but that's neither here nor there. The point of view goes back to Fern, who's on the phone with her mother, and up until this point, Fern thinks that the worst thing that had ever happened in her life was having to divorce her ex because of all the hurtful things he had said, but this interaction with Fern's mom really highlights how toxic her and her mom's relationship is. I really want to say I'm someone who does not like to use the word toxic to describe people very often. I think it gets thrown around a bit too much, but this is a toxic relationship. I don't want to diagnose Fern's mom as a narcissist, but she keeps turning everything back around on Fern, saying, it's not my fault, I didn't file all your taxes, you were going through divorce, and that was hard for me because your ex-husband, he was like a son, I considered us a family, you tore us apart. Fern is completely sidetracked. She goes, Mom, he was hurting me, that's why I divorced him. But her mom takes her ex-husband's side, and her ex-husband's name is Chet, so her mom takes Chet's side. And during this conversation, Fern's mom also manages to slip in a bunch of criticism of Fern's appearance, saying you should never have cut your hair after the divorce because Chet liked it long. Fern is doing everything she can to get the conversation back on track and asks Mom, like, where did the money go? I was setting aside money for taxes that you were supposed to file. Where did it go? To which her mom admits that she actually gave all that money to Chet to help him get through the divorce. Fern's mom goes on to then insult Fern's job, which she owns and runs her own cafe. And apparently Fern's mom was checking in on Fern earlier because she says, hey, I drove by the cafe earlier and you weren't there. Fern says, I took the day off. My friend and coworker Serafina is there. Fern's mom immediately jumps to, you didn't make yourself 4 dozen cookies and eat them all by yourself. And she says, just because you work at a bakery doesn't mean you have to eat everything in it. Fern tries to call her mom's action out. She asks, why do you have to be so cruel all the time? Don't you care that I could go to jail for tax evasion? Fern's mom calls her dramatic and says, it's not that big a deal. I can loan you the money. But, caveat, I will only loan you the money if you get back together with Chet. At which point, Fern goes and throws up in the bathroom. So after throwing up and I assume cleaning herself himself up a little bit. Fern goes back to the living room where Anu is still waiting for her, and he asks, "Are you okay? I heard you throwing up," which makes her feel embarrassed because he heard her being sick. And Anu says there's nothing to be embarrassed about because that's normal, and I'm asking because I'm worried about you. Fern, who has just had this very awful encounter and awful news, just says, "Man, nobody ever cares about me." Anu lets out a quote ferocious growl unquote and asks, "What do you mean nobody ever cares about you?" And she gets a little fluttery. "Oh, he's upset on my behalf? I don't understand what's going on with all of these emotions." Fern asks Anu, "Okay, how much do I owe the IRS?" And while the text doesn't say the exact number, it's enough to make her feel like she wants to throw up again. Anu's first and only thought is to reassure Fern, everything's going to be okay. I'm going to be here to help. We're going to take this step by step. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get the last 2 years worth of taxes filed, and we're going to see if we can set you up on a payment plan. Anu is just all about, this is no longer what's happening to you, this is what's happening to us. Fern's starting to feel a little bit less depressed, but she's thinking she doesn't know how she'll ever get out of this mess. And it's important to note that she also thinks about how her father, who died 5 years ago, was the one who left her the money to be able to start the cafe, but that she knows she doesn't have enough left, and she doesn't know how she's going to be able to pay all of this even if she gets on a payment plan. And she's like, "I'm doomed." And Anu says, "We're going to get through this together." At which point Fern's body and brain kind of short circuit. She looks over at Anu sitting on the couch and whimpers, and the text is very specific that this is not a whimper of pain or agony, it's a whimper of need. The perspective switches back to Anu, who's thinking to himself that up until this point he has never in his life been tempted like this, especially with someone he's supposed to be auditing. But the second that he hears Fern whimper, all his professionalism is out the window. The reader learns that Anu actually has a dormant alpha, just like some werewolf shifter romances do, where the wolf side is actually a separate personality from the man side. There is an alpha inside of Anu that is in addition to just his normal Anubis personality, and Anu's alpha takes control of him for a second and pulls Fern into his lap, and Anu thinks to himself that he thought he had suppressed his alpha because it has no place in human society or the way that he engages in human society, and he thinks, "I've never even been tempted to go into a rut because Anubis can only go into a rut when there's another Anubis female who's in heat somewhere." But because he travels so much for the IRS, he pretty much never has had a chance of that happening. He's very confused about why he feels this sensation, but the smell of Fern he's very aware of it, and he's even aware that she's in heat, it seems like, even though she's human, and that her heat is triggering his rut. So no matter what the IRS suit says, he can't help but grab her butt and hold her close. So for Fern's part, she's not holding back, and as soon as Anu starts to engage with her, she's all about it. She's not put off by the fact that he's a monster at all. She actually kisses his snout, and he thinks to himself like, "Oh my gosh, that's my first kiss," which I guess is like a secret interest. So the two are kind of groping and grinding on each other and making out to the best of their ability, and out of nowhere Anu lets out that he has a praise kink because he says, "Tell me I'm a good boy." Fern is not put off by that at all, and she doesn't miss a beat, and she's, "You are a good boy, you're doing a great job." Anu's completely overwhelmed. He can't help himself. He bites her neck. And if you're a fan of shifter romances or have ever dabbled in werewolves, you know that this is a claiming bite. I think this is so interesting because I don't know at what point in the romance novel development or in the lore of werewolves and vampires that, well, I guess vampires it's more obvious, but with werewolves, I don't know when the bite at the point where the neck and the shoulder meet, I don't know when that became a sexual act in and of itself, that to the point where it often gives like both the biter and the bitey an orgasm, which I think that would be a very interesting like timeline to establish. But anyways, that's what happens right now. Both Fern and Anu have the time of their life and their pants are still on. So we're still in Anu's point of view. We also do learn that he has a knot because he's thinking to himself that because they're not actually mating, thankfully he won't be walking around with this knot for the rest of the day, which is also another interesting development, I think, in the shifter genre is it would be very interesting to see when knots really first started to appear. I think I became aware of them 2023, maybe 2022. And the first time I read one, I was, oh my gosh, where's this been our whole lives? But anyways, I'm off track again. Anu is immediately apologetic. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." But Fern is not put off at all. She's just staring at Anu and she looks absolutely shell-shocked to him. But what she says is, "Wow, you mean me orgasm. She asks him, did you as well? And he's super embarrassed to say, yes, I did. In my pants. I feel like a kid because grown men or grown Anubis don't do that. But Fern reacts positively to this fact. Fern then says, wow, like no one's ever made me, And it takes a moment for Anu to figure it out. But then he goes, wait, hold on, wait, what? No one has ever given you pleasure like that before? And she shakes her head. And for like just a second, are you a virgin? His alpha is absolutely howling with victory and possessiveness because she's ours and only ours. But Fern goes, no, I'm not a virgin. I was actually married until about 2 years ago, but I've been divorced. Before Anu can get too disappointed and jealous, his logical brain kicks in and goes, wait, why didn't your ex ever do this for you? Fern says, I don't think he was ever concerned about that. Anu is, what a jackass, but then immediately apologizes for using such quote unquote coarse language in the presence of a lady. Fern says, I don't know if I'm very much of a lady right now. And even though Anu knows that she's teasing, he's still kind of like upset by her words because he's gotten the impression like that Fern is very self-deprecating. And he goes, well, I was taught that that's a term of respect and that all women are ladies. He specifically says this, not in a way that the title puts restrictions on them, but in a way that it means that they deserve the highest respect from those around them. Fern and myself both have the same thought, which is, what? Where have you been all my life? Something I want to note here is that this, I think, one of the most fantastical elements of this whole book is how open and honest and vulnerable Fern and Anu are from moment one, not just in a physical way, but their honesty is something that you never see in romance novels. They just are, here are all of my thoughts, here are all of my truths. They don't hide anything from one another. And that's oftentimes a huge plot point in romance novels, is not fully communicating. But getting back, at this point, they're still on each other's lap and there's another knock on Fern's door and the two have to come back to reality. The point of view switches back to Fern, and it turns out that it's her mom and her ex-husband Chet who are at the door. Chet looks Fern up and down and is like, did you pee your pants? Before Fern can say anything, Fern's mom doesn't miss a beat and she's, oh my gosh, you're almost 40. What's wrong with you, Fern? Fern is, I'm not going to be 40 for 9 more years. So we have, doing some math, we now know Fern's 31. And we all know what it is that's on her shorts. So she's trying to defend herself, but she doesn't really know how to. She's trying to say that's not pee, but she doesn't want to be like, oh, it is what it actually is. Fern's mom now uses Fern's appearance to say, see, this is what I'm talking about. This is why you need someone to take care of you. You can't take care of yourself. And Fern ignores this and says, I need you to come back later without Chet. Fern's mom, who for some reason, which is never explained fully in the book, for some reason is very much on Chet's side and says, Fern, that's no way to talk to your husband. To which Fern says, that's not my husband. And all of this is happening very quickly on the front porch. And Anu, who has been in the background very quiet, unseen by Fern's mom and Chet, as he starts growling and steps forward. Fern's mom is, what the heck? Oh, is this the auditor? But Fern knows that their current rumpled appearance, if she tells her mom that Anu is the auditor, then her mom will immediately call the IRS and get Anu in trouble, which even though they just met, Fern does not want that to happen. So she just blurts out, no, he's not the auditor, he's my boyfriend. Anu doesn't miss a beat because he puts his arm around Fern's waist and pulls her up close and then shuts the door in her mom and Chet's face. Anu takes her back to the living room and Fern starts saying, I'm so sorry. Anu asks, what are you apologizing for? And Fern says, because of them, but also because of what just happened. And Anu says, ugh. He says that's a dangerous habit, apologizing for others, which I love that so much. Fern feels what he says very deeply, and she doesn't care about apologizing for Chet because she doesn't care about him, but we learn that she does have weirdness around her mom's behavior because her mom's behavior is extreme, but we learn that her father's dying wish was that she maintain her relationship with her mom. Fern thinks to herself that if it wasn't for that, she would not have any sort of relationship with her mom at all, but she had this very special relationship with her dad. She wants to honor that. Anu doesn't know that she's thinking this and says, actually, it's me who should be apologizing to you. I don't know what came over me. I couldn't control myself. And then he kind of asks, so why did you tell your mom that I'm your boyfriend? But Fern says, I just don't want you to get in trouble. My mom is the type of person that if she thought there was anything that was inappropriate, she would immediately try to get you fired. And Anu says, I should be fired for what I just did to you. And then he says, Fern, I marked you. Fern tries to wave it off and says, oh, it's no big deal. You bit me. I bruised. But Anu says, no, that's actually not what that means. This is how Anubis mark their mate, and it's permanent. So this is what I was talking about, that the non-consensual mating bite, it's immediately a plot point that is up for discussion and apology and stuff. So Anu explains that somehow he was thrown into a rut and his alpha has now chosen Fern as his mate. You can tell even as I'm like recapping this, I'm getting all melty because Anu is ideal. Anyways, Anu says there must be a female Anubis nearby that's in heat, and this is what caused me to go into this rut and to do this to you, and I'm so sorry. Fern, though, is feeling unexpectedly jealous that there could be another female nearby that could be causing Anu to be getting turned on, but also maybe turned up. I don't know. But her brain is also fixating on everything that they just did and what it would be like to do that a little bit more. Anu says that the bite is actually just the first step, and that there would be other things that we would need to do, like actually have sex to fully complete the mating bond. And the two are staring at each other and they're starting to get heated again. And in a last-ditch attempt to not just throw herself at Anu, Fern asks him, should I get a lawyer for my taxes? Which does reset the situation a little bit, and Anu says, no, I'm gonna help you. I'll get everything together. I'm gonna stay here in Cedar Heights. I'm gonna help you get your taxes filed, and in addition to that, I'm going to help you get a little bit of payback for your mom and Chet. His suggestion for how to get payback for Fern is to take her on lots of dates that might or might not involve orgasms. So the point of view switches back to Anu, who is thinking to himself that in Anubis culture, children are considered really sacred, but that the little bit that he saw of how Fern's mom just treated Fern, it has his hackles rising. Knowing that her mom didn't file her taxes for 2 years, it has him very suspicious of how she's treating Fern. He also thinks to himself that Fern is sunshine itself, and he just wishes he could bottle her up and carry her around with him, even though it wasn't intentional that he marked her. He can't really be mad about it. Still, he also did withhold a little bit of information about the mating bond, because it turns out that there's an aspect of it that affects Anubis but not humans. So when they mark their mate, basically you're bound together for the rest of your life, and to be too far away from your mate makes an Anubis feel sick and itchy. And I have to tell you, as someone who is a textbook anxious attachment style, this sounds delightful for me. I want to be with somebody who we get itchy and sick if we're not near each other. But that's neither here nor there. Anu thinks, I messed up, but thankfully, because Fern's a human, she is probably not going to feel the sickness the same way that he is going to. But now that he has done this to her, he's going to spend the rest of his life paying for it, because he's going to be feeling sick and drawn to her. He also is adamant with himself and his alpha that he is not going to tell her this, because he can already tell that she's the type of person that if she knows that he will suffer not being around her, that she'll go, okay, let's be together. She'll want to be with him so he isn't sick. He realizes after his very brief encounter with Chet how unhappily married she was, that she just got out of this marriage. What it comes down to is he recognizes that he took away her choice, and that he doesn't want to force her to have to choose him and to give up this freedom. So what we have on our hands is a little bit of a consent king, and even though it was an instinct for him to bite her, he will not force anyone to be in this partnership with him. His alpha doesn't like this, and he's at war with himself because he knows he's going to need to get away from her so he doesn't accidentally mark her in more ways and deepen the bond. But he also knows that she really needs his help, and so he can't just walk away and not help her through this. So this is all going on internally. Anu says, okay, I am going to stay in Cedar Heights. I have to go find lodging. I'm going to get settled, and then I want you to have dinner with me. And Fern says, okay. But she is also, hey, this is a very small town. Just so you know, everyone's going to see us and they're going to talk about us. And Anu says, well, that is the point, that people will see. It's going to reinforce that you're in a relationship. And then maybe your mom will leave you alone for a little bit. And for a moment, Fern hesitates, but she says, yes, let's do it. Let's have dinner tonight. There's only really one diner in town, but yes, let's go. Anu says, yay! Internally, he doesn't say that, but he feels like we have this connection. And he's very torn by, I need to respect this woman that I just met, and I need to give her some space. And also, like, I want to be on top of her, not that way, but also that way, but like I want to be in her personal space until she realizes that we need to be together for the rest of our life. So he gets control of himself. He goes, I'm gonna go find a place to live. And it turns out that as he was driving down the street away from Fern's house, he actually sees a house for rent. So it's pretty close to Fern's house. It's a lovely old Victorian style house. And he decides, you know what, rather than getting a hotel, I'm going to rent this house because I'm going to be in town for a lot longer than I was originally planning. He calls the number on the sign, asks the woman, can I do a month or 2 month contract? To which the woman on the other end of the line says, that's no problem. I actually live next door and the house belonged to my sister, and it all works out immediately. Anu pulls over, boom, boom, bang. He meets this old woman named Francine, who is that sassy old lady, that kind of character trope who's wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And she is, wow, aren't you handsome? You're a really cute Anubis type guy. And she asks, are you single? And he hesitates like, oh, but she laughs it off. And he goes, not for me. I'm an old lady, but I have this really beautiful niece. I want her to find someone. Anu goes, actually, I'm not single. And whether that's because he already decided that Fern belongs to him or because he knows that they're playing a game of him pretending to be her boyfriend, it's not entirely clear. But Francine and Anu quickly come to terms on a deal for the house, and she gives him the key and he moves in right away. So, I mean, like, this book has moved very fast. A lot has happened in a very short amount of time. So the point of view switches back to Fern, who has gone back to the cafe. She runs in and says to all the customers, sorry, I actually need all of you to leave. It's a family emergency. And everyone is confused, but it's a small town. Everybody knows Fern's and they're all regulars, so they don't really question it. And Fern is thinking about Anu's promise to give her lots and lots of orgasms. As soon as everyone's out the door, she turns to her coworker slash best friend Serafina and then, I have a date. It's with an Anubis and he's also auditing me. And thankfully, Serafina goes, okay, but also tell me everything. Fern thinks to herself, I'm going to tell Serafina everything, but I'm going to not tell her about what my mom did, because it turns out that Sarah, really hates Fern's mom. Fern fills her in, and Sarah's reaction is, I cannot believe you just let a stranger touch you. And she says it in not a judgy kind of way, but in a, oh my gosh, you've got so many boundaries and barriers up. I can't believe you just let yourself be so vulnerable, like that kind of excited sort of way. So Fern tells Sarah that the date boyfriend situation is a sham, and Sarah says that she thinks that the whole thing is a great idea. Fern and Anu should definitely take advantage of each other in the best, most filthiest possible way. A little side plot that's building is Fern makes a throwaway comment that she says, quote, how can Sarah look like an angel but think like a devil, quote unquote. Sarah flinches and then deflects. So he just got like a teeny tiny baby just born plot bunny. Sarah says, what do we need to do to get you ready? Let's find you some clothes. So it turns out there's an apartment above Fern's cafe that Sarah's been living in. So they've closed the shop. They go upstairs. Sarah's insistent that Fern tries on some of her clothes. Fern is, okay, I'll try on your clothes. But even as she says that, she hears her mom's voice in her head saying that there's no way, that she's too big. She'll never fit in Sarah's clothes. Sarah's like a model and stuff. Fern doesn't say anything like this out loud, but Sarah turns and goes, hey, that's your mom's voice that's going on in your head and you need to stop. And Fern laughs and goes, hey, are you able to read my thoughts? But Sarah goes, no, I just have heard your mom spit poison at you so many times that I know what's going on inside you. Sarah says that Fern is absolutely stunning inside and out, and that her mom is not a good person. And apparently Sarah has a lot of thoughts, because she says that Fern's mother is, quote, masking cruelty as concern. And I loved that sentence. So Fern feels that she can't help but defend her mom a little bit. She says, my mom is hard on me because she loves me. Sarah shoots back that if Fern's mom said that anybody else, like the things that she says to her, if she said that to Sarah, she asked, would Fern think that that was acceptable? Or if Fern's mom called Sarah fat, would that be acceptable? And Fern is, absolutely not. Sarah hits her with the good old, well, then why is it okay for her to do it to you? To which Fern has no true response, and Sarah pushes just a little bit more and says that Fern is one of the kindest, sweetest people, and it pisses her off that her friend's mom uses Fern's greatest strength against her, which is her kindness and her empathy and her love for everything around her. So we also have now established that Sarah and Fern are very open, very vulnerable. Nobody in this book holds anything back. Everybody says what they mean and means what they say. Spoiler, until they don't. Anyways, they move past this very endearing conversation and they get back to talking about the date, and Fern is thinking to herself, even though I just met him, there's something between them, and she's very excited that Anu wants to explore it further, and she feels this little flicker of hope in her chest. She even kind of plays with the idea that maybe she might be into this mate thing, and you know, what would this entail? And I find it kind of appealing. And she's a little appalled because, you know, she realizes she just got divorced, but she doesn't mind the idea. She doesn't really get a chance to follow through on that thought process because Sarah starts bringing out beautiful dresses for her to try on. Elegant, but not overly formal. Fern loves the dress that Sarah picks for her, but she thinks, oh, there's no possible way that I'll fit in it. Sarah says, you just need to trust me, and miracle of miracles, it fits. I really like this scene because it clearly highlights the body dysmorphia that Fern has, that she can look at a clothes and she doesn't immediately think that they'll fit her. And it's clear from the book that she's a curvy girl. She's not a stick figure, but it's also clear that her self-concept has been greatly exaggerated by the relationship that she's had with her mother and Chet. Sarah says, I feel bad for Anu because he's going to have the biggest boner as soon as he sees Fern, and it's going to hurt. And they both laugh about that, but Fern's laughter trickles off at the thought of him being turned on by her. And when Fern really looks at herself in the mirror, she starts to feel a spark of confidence that she hasn't felt in a really long time. And she realizes, I feel sexy. And Sarah is right there. She's continuing to hype her up, pointing out that just because her ex-husband was such a D-bag, it doesn't mean that Fern is not actually worthy. And she hopes that Fern will find the ability to see how wonderful she is. And Fern admits that her ex-husband's words do haunt her. She mentally reflects on how even though she managed to divorce him, it's like he's haunting her and she's never been able to fully sever that mental cord between the two of them. Sarah says, yeah, that's doesn't matter that it's been 2 years. It takes time for wounds to heal, especially the emotional and mental ones. Fern then leaves for the date. She goes to the diner, and as soon as she walks in, she feels a wave of anxiety, but she thinks to herself, I need to give this a shot. So the perspective switches back to Anu, who's sitting at the diner booth, and it apparently is like way too small for him, and he's like a big old puppy. He's also doing his best to kind of tune out what the other diners are doing. They are kind of watching him, whispering, pointing, but not in a malicious way. It's just that he's a monster in a mostly human town. He also knows that there's a lot of rumors about his Anubis species and whether or not they can actually control life and death. So he's used to it. He's okay with it because he understands that he's probably the most exciting thing that this small town has seen. And small towns like this also thrive off of gossip. So Fern comes in the doorway and he sees her in this dress and he starts to have all kinds of fantasies that she's standing there looking at him like she is a sacrificial offering to the ancient gods, and that he would gladly offer himself to be able to worship her. And he notices that there's this duality in him and his inner alpha. His inner alpha is wanting her to be spread out for him, while he wants to be spread out for her. And he tells his inner alpha, like, down boy. And his inner alpha, which is definitely a secondary personality, backs off but is grumbling and growls inside of him, letting him know, like, I'm giving you a little bit of space and time, but I'm watching you, pal. We then learn from Anu's internal dialogue that because he's an alpha, he's supposed to be the embodiment of a leader. We get a little bit of more world building. So in the Anubis species culture, everyone's born into a hierarchy that is supposed to dictate their sexual orientation, and that this is shown on specific ridges and markings on their bits and pieces. According to the markings on him, he's supposed to be a dominant alpha, but he is an outlier because while his body is the body of an alpha, he wants to be a submissive, and he's never heard of that anybody in his species that's ever been like that before, and it really goes against what's ingrained in his DNA. But he thinks to himself as Fern walks up that he wants nothing more than for Fern to push him to his knees and tell him he's a good boy. He gets up to greet Fern. It's also clear he smells her arousal. I loved this part because even though he knows she's reacting to him like this, he thinks to himself, quote, arousal does not equate to acceptance, end quote. Air horn. This book is full of all of those little gems of consent is the new sexy. The fact that he's that kind of mental thought that just because he can smell her arousal doesn't mean he can assume anything about what's going to happen on the date between them is just, it's hot as hell. So the two sit down and he can tell that even though she's really excited to see him, she's also uncomfortable, and he realizes it's not because of him, it's because of the stares of the other people in the diner and they're disconcerting her. But he still asks her what's wrong because, you know, he doesn't want to assume. And she says, I don't really like being the center of attention. Even though he had kind of guessed what was making her uncomfortable, her words soothe him because he realizes that some part of him thought that maybe she was embarrassed at the stares because she was with him, but in reality it's just her own shyness that's at play. And he says, thank you. Oh, this love is so sexy. He says, thank you for clarifying. Sexiest thing I've ever heard in my life. And then he tells her, don't worry, because everyone's not staring at you, they're staring at me because I'm a monster. And she says, well, you know, that's probably part of it, but also probably the fact that I'm divorced. She says, my ex-husband made like a huge scene at the courthouse afterwards after they had signed the divorce papers. It was such a big scene that the cops had to hold him back. And that's exactly the kind of gossip that Cedar Peak Heights is still talking about, even a couple years later. Anu finds himself reacting to the idea that her ex-husband could be violent in any way, but Fern assures him it was just verbal abuse. It was never truly reached the point of physical abuse, but that obviously doesn't matter. The waitress comes up and takes their drink orders before handing them a couple of menus, and Fern immediately reacts to the menu. She goes pale and starts shaking, and Fern asks the waitress, oh, are these new menus? And the waitress says, yeah, the restaurant got sold about 6 months ago. The new owners revamped the menu. So Fern is clearly uncomfortable about something, but we don't really know what it is. She asks the waitress, what do you recommend off the new menu? And the waitress just goes, oh, it's all good. I couldn't really just pick one thing. Anu is trying to read her. He's trying to figure out why she looks like someone ripped the rug out from underneath her. He's studying her face really closely, and he realizes she's squinting at the menu and her eyes are kind of like darting back and forth, and she's very slightly moving her lips like she's trying to read, and it hits him that Fern is struggling to read the menu. And he completely relates to this because apparently while Anubis are blessed with all these amazing physical abilities like being super fast, super strong, so their heightened perception of smell, and it causes sensory overload that translates to almost every single Anubis has dyslexia. Within his community, since it's so common, everybody gets taught strategies from a very young age to work with their dyslexia. And he also reflects on himself, like, even though it was very common and he had all this help, it was still a huge pain, and it was a huge struggle for him and for everyone in the family to get to the point where they could read with some level of comfort. It took years and years and years of training, and he still has to really focus. So as soon as he sees Fern and it clicks in his head, he feels nothing but empathy. He also doesn't want to embarrass her and be like, hey, you can't read, because even though he's pretty sure this is what's going on, he doesn't want to assume. So he thinks back to one of the strategies that his parents used to use with him. He looks at Fern and he goes, oh man, this all looks so good. I'm kind of torn between two items on the menu. Can you help me pick one out? Oh man, there's this really good looking cheeseburger, but there's also this pasta. He starts to name, oh, there's this food and this food. And Fern is, oh my gosh, I love all that food. I could eat all of it. It's so sweet. He basically gives Fern the ability to order comfortably without having any more embarrassment. The two, as they wait for their food, they talk about their job, and Fern says, I love the cafe that she made. And Anu thinks to himself that anyone looking on at them, they wouldn't know that this wasn't a real date. And he finds himself forgetting that this is not a real date because he feels so at ease with Fern. He marvels that they only met a few hours ago and that they have this really easy banter, but it's also a little bit hot and flirtatious. He definitely notices that people are looking at that the two of them will be the talk of the town, which he reminds himself is the main reason that they went on this date, was to be able to throw everybody off from the fact that he's the auditor. So it's the end of dinner, and he reaches over to touch her hand, and he says that he feels this like spark of electricity shiver down his spine. And he also notices Fern trembling too. He can smell her, and she says, oh hey, I know this place has like really good pie, but why don't you come back to my place for dessert? He knows that if he goes back to her place that she's going to be the dessert, and he goes, yes, I want to go back to your place. So the point of view switches back to Fern. It's actually the start of their date again. And it's from her perspective now that she's walking into the diner and she sees him sitting at the table waiting for her, and he's dressed way more casually than his suit. He's in dark jeans and a white t-shirt. And she thinks to herself, I'm just this total puddle. She's also hyper aware of the other diner's gazes, feels a little bit of awkwardness and uncertainty, but she's also certain that, as she puts it, for some mysterious reason, she wants this man and he wants her as much as she wants him. Like, she's certain of this. So the scene replays that she's taken off balance by the menu, and from her perspective we get confirmation that she's trying to read the menu, but instead that the words are swimming about on the page, and she's starting to have a headache. And when she looks up at Anu, she sees him seeing her and that he can tell something's wrong. She braces for a comment, but instead of calling her out, he starts to do what he did in the previous chapter, which is to name different things on the menu that sound really good. And Fern is just ready to fall apart at his kindness because it's just so rare for her, especially apparently in a partner. So their food comes. It's really interesting that the author does that, because now we get back to the conversation that they were having, but we get new dialogue from Fern's perspective. It goes into more detail about how much she loves making stuff at the cafe, that she loves making spice drinks and pumpkin goodies and whatnot. We also get the detail that Anu says that Fern reminds him of fall because of her just hair and her vibe. And Fern says, actually, my dad wanted to name me Autumn, but my mom said no. And we have have a cute conversation about if she could have any birthday cake, what would it be? And she's chocolate on chocolate on chocolate. Anu says, I would love to try chocolate, but I can't. It upsets my stomach. Fern makes a comment, oh yeah, it's the same with dogs. She gets embarrassed. Anu's like, no, it's okay. It's totally fine. There's definitely similarities between the Anubis and dogs, just like there are similarities between humans and apes. And I can't take offense to what you just said. And Fern is, wow, you are so understanding, because I'm sure that must get old, is people making those comparisons. Anu says, yeah, it does, but I just take it as an opportunity to have conversation with people. Fern continues to apologize though, and she's even a little self-deprecating and says, I'm just so lousy at dating. And Anu goes, no, you're not. I'm just enjoying your company so much. And this is so nice because my job as an auditor on the road, it can be very lonely at times, and I don't get a chance to interact with a lot of people. Our date finishes off exactly where it left off, with Anu saying, yes, I want to come back to your place and have you for dessert. Point of view switches back to Anu now, who is filled with tension as he drives back to what he describes as his luscious little redhead's house. And he's excited because as soon as they're inside her house, again, they don't even hesitate with each other. Fern leaps into his arms, he catches her, they stumble to the living room. Something happens that I feel like I've been seeing more and more in romances in just the last year. The last handful of romance novels that I've gotten have all had a scene where when the woman orgasms, she makes a mess. I don't know what the polite term is for this, but she's just everywhere. I think that that's so interesting because that was never a thing that was described in any romance I've ever read in the history of my life. All of a sudden, it's popping up more and more and more. And not only that, but that the partner in the relationship absolutely loves it. So Fern has an orgasm like that, and she's just, oh my gosh, I made this huge mess. But the intensity of her pleasure just eggs Anu on. We are not going to clean this up because we're just going to get even more filthy together. I really appreciate this trend that I've been seeing about, it's not just men in romance novels caring that a woman gets their pleasure, but taking true pride in their ability to just absolutely wreck a woman, which I'm totally down for. Get that more into the public sphere, please. So from Anu's point of view, where we're seeing all of this from now, we hear him arguing a little bit with his alpha, who's really wanting to take control, but Anu is, nope, we are going to give Fern what Fern needs, and we're going to focus on that. And it says that for the next hour, his alpha goes, okay, fine, we're gonna make our goal to make every subsequent orgasm better than the last. Even though Anu is very turned on, he's insistent. Tonight is all about Fern and not him, but Fern insists. She says, I want you to have a taste of the same pleasure that you're giving me. And they don't have sex. They do have a very naughty interaction that I'm not going to go into any more depth than I just did with. But what comes out is Fern is ecstatic to see that Anu is pierced and that he has some sort of cuff thing around himself. And Anu explains that it covers his ridges that show his status within the Anubis world. I just had the thought, like, we know that male Anubis have these ridges on themselves that establish what part of their status they are within their community. But it also makes you wonder, like, what do the females have a special marking anywhere? So Fern is, oh, I want to see your ridges and I want to touch those ridges. And a callback to the earlier encounter, Fern calls him a good boy, and he really, really likes that. And I just love this so much. She doesn't even miss a beat. He indicated to her that he has this want and need, and they don't even have to have a conversation about it. She just pivots and is, I'm into this. I want to give you what you find enjoyable, which is exactly what he's been trying to do for her this whole time. And to top it all off, when they are both done, they agree that this is the best dessert that they've ever had. They make a date to go out again tomorrow, but that this time they're going to actually get dessert. Text switches back to Fern's point of view, and it covers 5 days very quickly, where she thinks to herself that they are successfully convincing everyone that they are a couple, as well as successfully pissing off her mom. While Fern thinks this is funny, she's also really annoyed by her mom because her mom has been pestering her so hard. She's also reflecting that her and Anu are growing closer and closer, and she is starting to wonder if she's crossing some sort of line. She thinks to herself that faking a relationship with an IRS auditor probably wasn't her best idea, but that she's finding herself holding on to the fantasy of it. And she also says that she was trying to put a little bit of a distance between them, but that's becoming increasingly challenging because he's just so kind. She specifically uses the word tender. So she's at work in her cafe and Serafina is there, and they're making coffee for customers, and Serafina asks her how how is the quote-unquote auditing going, with like a wink and a smile. And we all know what Serafina means. Serafina says, sometimes the fantasy can actually reveal the truth of a situation, and that love doesn't always follow a neat and predictable path. And when Serafina says the word love, Fern feels her heart stop. She kind of doesn't know how to respond to Serafina. She's about to, deny, no, it's not love, it's just, it's just what it is, when someone comes into the cafe and is like, hi, I'm here to talk to Fern. I'm from a coffee grounds company. Fern realizes that she forgot that she had this deal in motion where she was going to start featuring coffee from local businesses. While she recovers herself, she reflects that her and this coffee ground company have only been communicating through email, and we get a reminder here that until previously her mom was involved in every aspect of her business, including reading all of her emails and telling her what was in it. But Fern has halted all of her mom's involvement in the cafe. So she and the coffee ground representative talk for a little bit, and he says, here, I have the contract for you, but can you read this letter first, because it outlines that we made a couple of minor changes in the contract and we just need you to look over them. Fern, immediate dread, because as soon as she opens the contents and unfolds the paper, it all starts to look barely legible. The letters swim around, and she thinks to herself, man, it took her a small eternity to read the initial contract on her own. But she doesn't say anything. Even though she doesn't say anything, Serafina just steps in and is, oh, hey, what's all this about a new coffee contract? Serafina looks over the contract and is like, oh, that's interesting, look at this. And oh, hey, I see that you want to do that. And she reads the important points out loud. Even though Serafina doesn't officially know that Fern's dyslexic, it's clear that she seems to have some kind of understanding that Fern needs these supports and scaffolds. In the moment, Fern can't express her gratitude to Serafina for this, because she thinks to herself she probably would have just signed the contract anyways, even without being able to read it, just to avoid anyone finding out her capital S secret. But with Serafina's surreptitious help, Fern feels comfortable signing the contract, and the coffee grounds guy leaves. But before he does, he says, hey, if you have any questions, I'll text you. And Fern's, I don't text, which the coffee grounds guy looks at her and she's a weirdo in this day and age. He leaves, and Fern's just feeling like the weight of this huge secret on her chest, and Serafina is obviously picking up on this and says, hey, are you okay? Fern tries to say, yes, I am, but Serafina calls her out and says, no, you're not. You're lying to both of us, and whatever it is that's bothering you, I can tell it's been bothering you since the day that we met. Serafina says, everyone has painful secrets, and I just want you to know that if you ever trust me, I would be happy to share your secret with you. Fern says, everybody has painful secrets, even you? Question mark, question mark. And Sarah goes, yeah, I do, even me. So they decide on a you tell me yours, I'll tell you mine type of situation. And Sarah goes, okay, I will tell you mine, but you have to absolutely promise that it changes nothing between us, and you seriously can't tell anyone, and also you can't stop being my friend. So Sarah comes out and tells Fern that she is actually a monster, not a human being. She is what's called a seraphim. So Fern's response to this is, wow, you're a seraphim and your parents named you Serafina? It's clear that Sarah is nervous, and Fern says, hey, are you okay? Like, did you really think I was going to react poorly to you telling me this? And Sarah says, like, no, but not you specifically, because you have this beautiful heart, but it's obvious that people are still very uncertain about monsters. And then don't get me started on your mom. Fern points out that her mom hates everybody. Then also goes on to say that she thinks there just aren't a lot of monsters in Cedar Peak Heights, and it's probably more due to lack of experience than it is actual dislike. And the two hug, and Sarah says sorry, and Fern says, whoever you are, however you are, I love you, I support you no matter what. And they just have this really beautiful moment together, and that gives Fern the courage to say, I'm dyslexic. Sarah's immediate reaction is, oh my gosh, have you been carrying this burden all by yourself? And I think it's so beautiful how Sarah immediately recognizes the struggle and the strength that Fern must have had to get to where she is in her business and her life, with also having this going on, this learning need. Fern goes, no, my mom knows. And Sarah actually growls at that, and it startles Fern, and Sarah goes, no, I'm not mad at you, I'm mad at your mom, because I can imagine the type of help that she's offered you to support you through this need. Fern is defensive at first. She says, no, she's always been helpful for me, she reads everything for me, and if it weren't for her, I wouldn't even be able to act like a normal person. And Sarah, just like Anu, I don't know if it's just monsters who have this kind of perspective or what, but just like Anu, Sarah hits Fern with just absolute love, empathy, and truth. She goes, first of all, you are normal. Second of all, doing everything for you isn't helping you, it's actually making you dependent on someone else, and it's absolutely feeding into your self-doubt, which is what your mom does anyways. And Fern doesn't know what to say to this, so she tries to change the subject in the, what kind of monster is a seraphim? And in this world, not in the mythological world, but in this world, they're like a type of elf, and they are connected with life, and specifically with bringing someone or something to life. If Sarah does that, she's going to get her wings. So far, she's done absolutely basically everything she can to avoid bringing in anything to life, including gardening. A little bit of time passes. They're both digesting what the other person has said. Fern says, you know what, you're right, Sarah. Avoiding reading hasn't actually worked out for me. Relying on my mom has only made it worse. She really does. She treats my dyslexia like it's a curse, and it makes me feel stupid. Fern goes on to say that she barely passed school and that her mom told her to never tell anyone, and that her mom actually did most of her schoolwork, and everybody just believed that Fern was dumb, including her dad. And Sarah is just, oh my god, you mean your dad didn't know? Sarah tells Fern straight out, this is child abuse. And this is what Sarah says. She says, when you don't help your child, you're not doing your job as a parent. And Fern again just doesn't know what to say about this. And something, yeah, I've said it before, something I really appreciate about this book is just how explicitly they say things. And I want to say this for this author in general, for all of her books in this Monster Meet Cutes universe that she's created, is that there's no hemming and hawing and maybe the other person understands, maybe they don't understand. All of her characters are very explicit in their communication, very direct in a way that it doesn't leave room for the trope of misunderstanding. And I personally find this very refreshing. So Fern also admits that her mom told her to never tell anyone, including Fern's father, about her dyslexia. And Serafina is just raging. She's foaming at the mouth. She can't believe that Fern's mom would isolate her like this. In fact, she does call it child abuse because Fern's mom was clearly not trying to help her succeed. She was actively trying to hide that Fern needed help. In response to this, Fern's flabbergasted. Fern asks Sarah, well, why did you hide your monster? And Sarah admits that both of her parents were actually killed by humans who hated monsters. So Sarah was raised by her grandma, who died a couple of years ago, and now the only family that she has left are a couple of friends of her grandma who live here in Cedar Peak Heights. And we find out that they are Deneen and Francine Hubble. And Francine Hubble is that older lady that Anu is renting the house from while he's here doing the audit. So Sarah says that Francine actually offered to let her live in Deneen's house, but Sarah admits that she can see ghosts, so she happens to know that Deneen is still there and she just didn't want to stay there. Two friends, they hug it out, they laugh, they say like, oh, I guess we're both a little broken. Fern says something really cute. She says maybe we can be one another's glue, which again I appreciate because Fern is obviously having this very, very close relationship with Anu right off the bat, and it would have been so easy to make Anu the center of her life and the point of her healing that I appreciate that the author made it another female friend. And to this, Sarah says, you heal me, I'll heal you. Sarah says that in the first order of business is she's going to keep prescribing Fern orgasms because nothing is better than a really good orgasm. And they're hugging and they're laughing, and then all of a sudden Fern's mom comes into the bakery, and this really peaceful moment is now ever. Switch back to Anu's perspective, and he's thinking that it's been nearly a week since he has gotten into Cedar Peak Heights, and it's honestly the most interesting audit he's ever had. He's having a little bit of an internal argument with his inner alpha, who is ready and willing to say, forget your honor, Fern belongs to us. But Anu says to his alpha, well, that's not how this works, especially not in this day and age. And he works to focus on the audit. As he goes through it, he's finding himself more and more impressed by everything that Fern has managed to accomplish in the last 5 years, that she's built this successful business, that she's overcome all these obstacles, and that in fact, statistically speaking, most small businesses would go under really quickly after they open. But as he goes on through her paperwork, he's starting to realize that the math ain't mathing and that there are irregularities in the numbers. It could just be a simple mistake, but both him and his inner alpha have this very serious feeling that this is not a mistake. Anu knows that Fern's mother helps her with her finances, and he can't help but put two and two together and think that her mom has to have something to do with this. He doesn't want to jump to conclusions, so he's just about to call Fern when, and I should have mentioned, he's at Fern's house working at this. All of her boxes are there. He's just about to call Fern. Her front door opens. He gets up because he's thinking, oh, Fern must be home, so I'll just go talk to her. But it's not actually Fern. It's her ex-husband, Chet. And him and Chet stare at each other, and then Chet's, what are you doing here? He doesn't say that. He says something else, but the polite thing that he says is, what are you doing here? And Anu is, hey, I'm just making myself at home. Chet responds by going from 0 to 10, yelling like, you just can't waltz into my wife's house and you've got another thing coming. And he calls Anu a dog, and Anu just brushes off the name calling. He says, actually, that's an unimaginative slur. That he says, first, she's not your wife. Secondly, Anubis are jackals, they're not dogs. Mansplains to Chet why his insult was a bad insult, which I love because absolutely nothing kills a joke harder than when you explain it to someone. Chet is actually like, are you too stupid to realize I'm insulting you? And Anu's, no, I think you're too stupid to figure figure out that your insult is inaccurate. And Anu is, I think this is really ironic because I'm actually trying to help you insult me better. Chet seems to think that ironic means moronic, starts to go off, and rather than continuing to argue, Anu's, why do you have a key to Fern's house? You need to leave because number one, she's not home, and number two, you're not welcome here. Chet is, oh, this is bullshit, I'm calling the cops. And Anu's, yeah, call the cops because you're not supposed to be here. And then Anu's just over it. He physically picks Chet up and shoves him out the door and locks the door on him. Anu is a little bit shook up because he personally never gets to that level of aggressiveness. He's a little worried that Fern might have a bad reaction to Anu taking such a proprietary stance against Chet for her, but before he can get much farther into thinking this through, Fern calls him and says, I'm so sorry I missed your call. Anu says, I'll get to that in a second. Listen, your ex was just at your house. He came into your house. Fern, why did you let him in? Anu says, no, he had a key. Fern immediately knows that it must have been her mom that had given Chet the key. Anu wants to check in with her. Are you mad at me for what I did? I lost my cool. I threw him out. And Fern is, absolutely not. You're one of the calmest, kindest people. I have no doubt that if you actually put hands on Chet, he 100%, he was at fault. Fern tells Anu to let her know that when Chet's gone, because she's going to lock up the cafe early and then come home. And she finishes up with saying a little flirtatious, I'm going to come home with dessert. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Anu says, hey, you got to cut that out because you're riling up my alpha. And then Fern asks, well, wait, what do you mean you're alpha? So then Anu explains to Fern what we already gleaned from his internal dialogue, that he has this internal alpha, that there's this rigid hierarchy in Anubis. It's a little bit adjacent to the Omegaverse, but it's definitely still a separate fantasy world that we're living in. We're not in the Omegaverse. I think that this book could definitely be a bit of a gateway drug to the Omegaverse, but basically an Anubis finds out where he is on the hierarchy. Within each Anubis, there's a voice in their head. Anu admits to Fern, he says, even though I'm an alpha, sometimes my alpha and I want very different things, and it feels like I'm arguing with another person. Fern asks, what kind of other things do you want that he doesn't want? And Anu says, well, remember how I said that alphas are dominant? Well, that's supposed to be sexually too. Anu admits that he feels more like a submissive. He feels more like an omega a lot of the time, even though his alpha is pushing him to be dominant. Fern doesn't miss a beat. She just says, hey, why can't you be both? Anu's a little taken back. He goes, well, you're one or the other. And Fern goes, yeah, but there's a thing called a switch, which is a person that enjoys both. Fern asks, within Anubis culture, are people allowed to be switches? And Anu's, I don't know. I don't think it's illegal, but it's definitely weird. Like, it goes against what's ingrained in our DNA. But what my heart wants and what my body wants are two different things. Fern is just, hey, let's give it both. Let's give it what Anu's wants and what the alpha wants. And Anu's alpha seems to really like this idea of Fern specifically being dominant with him, possibly because it just means that Fern is going to be getting closer, which is what the alpha wants. And obviously this conversation is leading to other thing, and it gets to the point where Anu says, hey, you need to lock up the cafe and come home right now. Fern says, I'm on my way. And then it's only after Fern hangs up the phone that Anu remembers, oh yeah, I was supposed to be talking to her about these irregularities that I'm finding in her taxes. So we switch back to Fern's perspective, which is picking up right when her mom is entering the cafe, even though Anu's perspective, Fern didn't call until after her mom left the cafe. Fern looks at her mom and thinks to herself that her mom is always dressed so pristinely, like she's off for some super fancy afternoon. It makes Fern feel frumpy next to her in her black leggings and big oversized t-shirt. Serafina just kind of snorts when they see her mom but doesn't say anything. Fern says, Mom, how are you? What brings you in? First words out of her mom's mouth are, why are you wearing this hideous color? It makes you look like yesterday's vomit, which is just the book honing in on this very abusive relationship. Sarah immediately pipes up to defend Fern, and then Sarah and Fern's mom start arguing. Fern's mom is like, how dare you let your employees do this? She's probably stealing from you. And Fern opens her mouth to defend Sarah and say, how dare you accuse her of stealing when you stole from me? But then Fern remembers, Sarah doesn't know about that Fern's mom had stolen her tax money and given it to Chet, so she just changes the subject. Sarah's about to keep the argument going, but Fern just grabs her and drives her away and says, hey, if you could pick one word to describe my mom, what would it be? It would be dramatic. She feeds off of drama, so you cannot give her what she wants. You got to stay away while I take care of this. So Fern goes back to talk to her mom, and her mom is, how come you're embarrassing me? And you're embarrassing me, and you're embarrassing everyone by dating a monster. Fern goes, I don't know who's embarrassed because I sure as heck am not. Her mom is, well, embarrassing me. You're cheating on your husband with an animal. Fern feels a huge amount of rage inside of her, but she works very hard to process through it, to stay rational in the moment, and she reminds her mom mom, again, her and Chet are divorced and that there's nothing in the entire world that will bring them back together. And her mom says, well, what about your taxes? Don't you need to borrow that money from me to fix your taxes? Fern says, actually, I figured it out. I found someone to help me with the IRS. They're going to help set me up with a payment plan, and actually, I don't need your money. And Fern's mom looks alarmed and says, you should not just trust some rando to do your taxes, and you shouldn't trust your finances with the government. And Fern's, I don't really have a choice thanks to you. Fern's mom, she's like, who's going to help you read? And she like stage whispers it. At least that's how I read it in the book. Fern's is on the spot. She's saying, I'm sending everything to the IRS. They're going to do my taxes and they're going to send me the paperwork, and Sarah's going to help me read it. Sarah knows about my dyslexia. Fern's mom loses it. I can't believe you told somebody. How could you? Fern interrupts her. Stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. Stop acting like there's something wrong with me. Stop acting like my dyslexia is the end of the world. You spent my entire life making me feel ashamed. And Fern mom tries to interrupt and is like, I just wanted to make sure no one ever made fun of you. But Fern shoots back with, you make fun of me. You tell me that I'm fat. And Fern's mom says, that's not making fun. That's just being honest. And then Sarah screams out from the background that Fern isn't fat and to stop body shaming her. And Sarah comes out from the back where Fern had put her and is, you need to back off. Fern's got this perfect little body. She's perfect. There's nothing to be shameful about dyslexia. And the only disappointment in this room is the fact you never got her the help that she would need. And Sarah says, Fern worked so hard. She's been successful. She doesn't deserve to put up with you. Before this can go any farther, Fern's phone rings. It's Anu calling her, and we know that he was going to call her right before Chet arrived at her house, so she doesn't get a chance to pick up the phone because of everything. But while she was momentarily distracted by the phone call, her mom leaves. Sarah is, why does she even come in here? She doesn't like this place. Fern said, she came in here to bug me about dating a monster, also about my taxes. And Sarah's, oh, you told her about the audit? Fern is, oh shit, I didn't tell Sarah the entire truth, which is that her mom stole from her. So Fern tells her now, and Sarah loses her shit and is, oh my gosh, you have to press charges. Fern says, I can't. I promised my dad I would take care of her. And Sarah says, yeah, but there's a line. And after a little bit more back and forth, Sarah goes, okay, listen, we're going to get you the help that you need to be able to read, so you do not have to rely on that woman anymore. At this point, Fern is free to call back Anu. They have the conversation that we already heard. Fern tells Sarah, I'm gonna go. Chet was at my house. Sarah goes, yeah, you probably should go because that phone call put a horny smile on your face, so go for several reasons. So Fern goes. We switch back to Anu's perspective. He's still waiting for Chet to leave. Chet's just hanging out in the front yard, and he's also waiting for the cops to show up. But before any of that can happen, Fern's mom shows up and she grabs Chet and drags him away from the house and puts him in the car. So if we didn't already know that they were in cahoots before this, it's very obvious. The author's yelling at us. Fern's mom is actively manipulating things behind the scenes. Shortly after that, Fern shows up and her and Anu break down everything that has been happening. Fern tells him also, she told me she's a seraphim, which I think is the one thing that happens in this book that I'm like, Fern, what the heck? Your best friend just told you this secret of theirs, that also that her parents were murdered, and you just kind of tell this random guy. And it's like, we know that Anu is a nice guy, but Sarah doesn't know Anu, and we don't know if Fern has Sarah's consent. But Anu's just, oh, that's interesting. I've never met a seraphim. I have met a Nephilim. He's a really good friend of mine, which we as readers, we can sense that this is a plot bunny and is going to be very important later. So they decide that because Chet has a key, that they're no longer comfortable keeping Fern's tax stuff at the house. They box it all up and they decide that they're going to take all of Fern's tax boxes over to the house that Anu's staying at, just to be safe. Anu drives Fern and himself over there. Francine comes out when they get there and is, oh, is this the lucky lady that's in your life? Is, oh, Fern is the best. No, but I would have loved you for Sarah, but nobody deserves happiness more than Fern. And then Francine turns to Anu and is, hey, since you're a death god, can you please tell my sister to stop with the pranks? Because apparently Deneen, her ghost, is going from haunting her old house to go next door to her sister Francine's house to bother and prank on Francine. Just flicker the lights, change the channel and stuff. Anu says, yes, I'll talk to her. As him and Fern go inside the house, we actually meet Deneen's ghost, who says to Anu, oh, is this the lovely lady that you've been pleasuring yourself to at night? Fern goes bright red and is, oh my gosh, are you doing that? But she's honored about it. Anu's, wait, can you see and hear Deneen? And Fern's, oh yeah, actually yes. I've always been able to see ghosts. It's just another crazy thing that my mom told me never to tell anybody about because they would make fun of me. Even Deneen pops in at this point and says, I've never met anyone more obsessed with what everyone else thinks than your mom. At that point, Deneen says, hey, you two crazy kids have fun. I'm gonna go next door and bother my sister. And Anu turns to Fern and says, like, I'm really sorry you had to hear that. I hope it didn't embarrass you. But Fern is, no, that didn't embarrass me. That made made me feel good. Before they can go any farther though, Anu says, actually, let's take your car back to your house and leave it in your driveway, because Anu had taken her car from her place. The reason why they want to do that is they don't want Fern's mom and Chet to see Fern's car parked outside of Deneen's place. So Anu says, hey, I'm gonna drive your car back and then I'm going to run back and I'll be back 3-4 minutes. Fern's, whoa, how fast can you run? And Anu's pretty fast. So Fern goes, hey, how about a bet? If you can make it back here in under 3 minutes, I'll give you a treat. Anu, okay. So I don't know if he speeds or not. He doesn't seem like the type of guy that would speed, but anyways, he drops off Fern's car and he's back. I have no idea if it's within the time or not. I think Fern and him both lose track. When he gets back, there's a very uncensored scene of Fern doing stuff to herself on Anu's rug. She is feeling very uncensored too, which is another indication of just how comfortable they are together. So the two proceed to have sexy fun times. Fern tells him, I'll be your dominant, you get to be the submissive, and Anu is overjoyed. And even his alphas, yeah, you take over, girl, I'm all yours. So they're messing around more and more, and then Fern brings up, hey, I would like to take your knot. Anu says that he loves that she wants to try, but that it would actually be impossible because alphas can only knot omegas, which sort of also follows the rules of the Omegaverse. Fern hears this and takes this as a challenge accepted situation, which, I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like a lot of us out there who might find ourselves in this situation would be like, yeah, let's just see what happens. Anu's, no, it would hurt you. We're not going to do it. So they just keep going anyways, and they're having like total amount of fun. Towards the end, Fern is losing her mind in a way that she's never lost her mind before. She thinks to herself, this is Anu. I've never felt this for anybody. This is Anu. Out of nowhere, she tells him, I need you to bite me, which is something that she's personally never wanted before. Anu says, that's not a good idea. And she's like, no, I need you to bite me right now. And in the heat of the moment, he does. Fern is riding super high. She's loving every minute of it. And it seems like Anu's loving every minute of it. After they're done, they're both kind of catching their breath and they start to fall asleep when they kind of catch each other's eye, and Fern thinks to herself, he kind of looks a little sad, which is a mirror to what she realizes that she's feeling as well. As she like drifts off, she thinks to herself, it wouldn't be bad at all if he stayed, and you know, what would happen if this didn't have to end? So we switch back to Anu's perspective, and he's blissfully happy but also troubled at the same time, because basically when Fern asked him to bite her, that was another step in the Anubis mating bond process. He's now fully marked her. He is going to be forever bonded to her, but he's also still is thinking she can never know, because she didn't know what she was asking me for when she was asking me things. He had started this process without her even being aware of it, and then it just kind of spiraled out of control, and he's just super aware of the fact that she just got out of this terrible relationship. He assumes that now that she's out, she wouldn't choose to bind herself to a male again. He also has the realization that when the audit is over, that means that their arrangement is going to be done too, and he's going to have to leave, which is absolutely unthinkable in Anubis culture, because he's going to be leaving his fully bonded mate, and that all that he can hope for at this point is that she doesn't feel the same that he feels at all, because he's going to be sick with longing. He finally decides that he can't sleep even though Fern is resting peacefully beside him, and he decides, I'm going to go back to work on her financial records. He also decides to call his friend Ender, who is in the Veil, which is the death realm. We learned that Ender is the teraphim that he had mentioned earlier, so we knew that Plot Bunny was gonna pop out somewhere. So Ender doesn't live on Earth, he lives in the Veil, and his kind of deal is that he tries to help monsters who are, they're lost monsters. They're monsters who are being persecuted by humans. There are monsters that are not sure that how they fit into the world. And we also learned that a teraphim is Sarah's opposite. So where seraphim are light bringers, he's a death bringer, which is one of the reasons why he and Anu are best friends. So he talks to his best friend. Anu says, I need your help with something, with this audit that's happening with my mate. And Ender's, gosh, congratulations, you found your mate. Anu says, actually, it's more complicated than that. So Anu enlists Ender's help in finding concrete evidence that Fern's mom has been cooking her books and actively stealing money from her, in addition to the tax money that she took and gave to Chet. Anu gets off the phone with Ender and then goes back to bed with Fern, when all of a sudden the ghost of Deneen pops up and says, oh my gosh, Fern's house is on fire. Fern jumps out of bed. Two jump out, they grab their clothes. Because Fern's car is over at Fern's house, Anu just picks her up and runs her over, and they roll up and the cops are like, whoa, who are you? Stay back. This is a crime scene. Anu says, this is my girlfriend's house. And before anything else can happen, the police lady grabs Fern, pulls her into a big hug, and is, oh my God, we all thought you were inside. We thought you were dead. We're so glad you're safe. Fern is absolutely devastated. This house that she's lived in, it was her grandmother's house. She's got all these memories there. Everything she owns is in there. She's just absolutely devastated. The police lady turns to Anu and says, hey, Fern shouldn't have to see this. So Anu picks her back up and takes her to Francine's house, where Sarah is already there, thankfully. Sarah and Fern grab each other. During this reunion where Fern is holding on to Sarah, the police lady calls Anu and they're talking quietly. Hey, it turns out that it wasn't just Fern's house that's on fire, it's also the cafe, which is where Sarah lives. The police lady tells Anu that this is almost definitely not an accident. This was done on purpose. So someone's trying to hurt Fern. It would be better if you took Fern and you got her out of town while they try to do the investigation. So Deneen, the ghost, who's heard all of this, says, oh, I know the perfect place. This secret place that not even my sister knows about. So they head onto the road. Fern at this point doesn't know that the cafe has burned. POV switches back to Fern, who is in shock that everything in her house is gone. She's comparing it to losing her father all over again, since all her childhood pictures and mementos are now destroyed. She's in shock and she's not really paying attention to where her, Anu, Sarah, and Francine are all taking her. They all piled into Anu's car. Anu pulls over at some point to get some snack because he knows it's going to help Fern with her shock, and Francine kind of leans over to Fern while he's inside and says that Fern is never going to find someone as good and thoughtful as Anu. They keep driving. Eventually they turn into the woods and they go to a log cabin that's very rundown and it's in the middle of nowhere. And Francine sees it and says that Deneen took them to Eckert's place. And Deneen's ghost pops up to say, oh my gosh, what do you mean you know about this place, Francine? Because Eckert told Deneen that she was the only woman that he had ever brought here. And Francine says that that man was a whore and brought all the women here. And the two sisters start bickering, but Fern is tuning them out. And Anu pulls her into a hug and she thinks that he feels like home. And apparently she says it out loud too, because Anu says that she feels like home to him too. Fern just wants to cry because all of a sudden at this point in this book where all of the good communication that's existed between the two is out the window and neither one is actually communicating very well, Fern is upset about everything, but she's also upset because she's telling herself everything between her and Anu is a lie, even though it's obviously not. Anu heads inside the cabin, which is dusty and apparently haunted by Eckert, who pops up and is like, hey, Deneen, baby, but then he immediately disappears when he sees that it's both Deneen and Francine. Deneen goes after him while the rest of everyone gets comfortable. Fern can tell that Anu and Sarah aren't telling her something, and Anu finally lets her know your cafe burned to the ground too. And Fern feels like she's just about to be buried under the weight of all the news, but she also immediately understands the importance of what he just said. She says, someone must have done this. Someone was trying to do this. And Fern, thinking out loud, says, there's only two people who don't like me, and it's my mom and Chet, but that she doesn't think either of them would do something like this. And Sarah says, actually, your mom would have a lot to gain by getting Fern to be quiet forever. And Fern says, no, they're not good people, but they're not murderers. So until answers can be found, Anu and Fern are going to hide at Eckert's cabin. Anu goes to check for supplies and try to clean the cabin a bit more to make it more comfortable. And when he's out of the room, Sarah tells Fern, hey, you need to marry Anu ASAP because that guy is absolutely head over heels for you. The two embrace because they both understand that the other person could have died. Like if Fern had been at home and Sarah had been at the cafe where she lives, they would not be here. So Fern tells Sarah that even though it's just things that she lost, she feels like she lost her dad and her grandma all over again, and she's about to crumple. And Anu swoops in and takes her off her feet right as she falls unconscious. And then Fern has a very naughty dream in which Anu asks her to be his mate, and she is all about it. Fern wakes up to Anu telling her to wake up while she finishes off the wet part of her wet dream, and she immediately apologizes for making a mess everywhere, to which Anu responds that he thought that they had already talked about how it's okay to give the body what it needs. And then she says that she feels bad because it's clear that he's turned on and she just doesn't feel like she can give him the release right now, to which Anu says that it's not her job to basically serve him every time the wind blows in the wrong direction, that he's perfectly capable of taking care of himself, but if what she needs is release or to just be held, then he'll do that for her. Fern and the reader both say that he really is perfect. Anu says no, he's just doing what anyone should do for their significant other. And then Fern throws some cold water on the situation and says fake significant other, and Anu winces but agrees, which is just, yeah, this is so weird. He says he made them some food, Sarah brought them some clothes to change into. Fern changes, she goes back into the living room where everyone still is at, and she's, wow, it's amazing, Anu cleaned everything so well, but her small happiness leave when everyone is clearly waiting to tell her some more bad news. We switch back to Anu's perspective, and he's telling Sarah that the deputy just called to tell him that the fires were definitely caused by Chet. Sarah says she's not surprised at all because Chet sucks, and if Fern's dad had been alive, Fern never would have married him. And then it was 100% Fern's mom who had pushed for the marriage, saying that it was the best Fern would get. So now Chet is in custody. He's being charged with arson and attempted murder. Sarah's glad about that, but also so sad because everything that Sarah had left of her parents was in the cafe when it burned, and everything Fern had left of her dad was in her house. It's not easy to tell Fern, but Anu lets her know, says that with Chet in custody, it should be safe for everyone to go back to Cedar Peak Heights. But Francine says, actually, I think it's a good idea if you, Anu, and Fern spend the night at the cabin, and that Sarah and Francine will come back and get them later. Sarah's going to stay at Francine's house. Fern is going to stay with Anu at Denine's house for a while. Fern agrees. This all makes a lot of sense, but she's also just sad. Anu's alpha is pushing him. You need to do more to Chet. You need to make this right. Anu realizes he's now fully thinking of Fern as his mate in his head. The group all eat dinner together. Then Sarah are going to head back to Cedar Peak Heights. Anu takes a moment to talk to Sarah and tells them, hey, you guys should take the car because he wants to stay here and take care of his mate. And Sarah goes, I knew it. She's your mate. You're in love and she's in love with you. Anu asks, did Fern tell you that she's in love with me? And Sarah says, no, but it's obvious to anyone with eyeballs. Anu's heart leaps, but his quote unquote logic refuses to believe it, which is just it's the exact opposite of everything that I liked about in the beginning. I think that this is the weakest part of the whole book, that the two were in such perfect communication and in every other aspect, and the fact that they're not able to communicate with each other about this, that they're not just not being able to communicate, they're making assumptions about what the other person is thinking and feeling. Nowhere else in their relationship has this dynamic been at play. I think there's enough conflict, there's enough plot tension from other aspects of the book that I think it would have worked just as well for them to be able to have talked about this all openly. But anyways, that's for the analysis section. Anu says he didn't mean to mark Fern, especially without her consent, and now that she's marked, she is his mate and Anubis mate for life, but that he would never force himself on her like her ex. And he tells Sarah that he plans to finish the audit and then let Fern be free. He says, why? You guys are perfect for each other and you both need to pull your heads out of your asses and acknowledge this truth where you guys missed this chance. Sarah and Francine leave and Anu thinks about what she said, and then he goes back and asks Fern, what would you like to do now? Fern says she wants Anu to stuff her inside his shirt so that she can feel his warmth and his smell and stuff. And I love that because I've been there where you just kind of want to you just want to merge with somebody. So the two cuddle. Fern, after a minute, she kind of mumbles something and Anu's, wait, what? Fern repeats herself, and what she said was she wants to try taking his knot. And I love this line. It says that Anu's inner alpha keels over at her words. I can just picture this so clearly in my head. Even though Anu's body and his alpha are 100% on board, he says that she's too small and it will hurt her. But I kind of like that Fern manipulates. She takes advantage of the emotionality of the situation. I know emotionality, I don't think it's a word. And she's like, but can we just try? He's at war with himself, but because he wants to try, but he doesn't want to hurt Fern. But finally Anu says, okay, we can try, emphasis on try. He's now so focused on Fern that he doesn't see Ender's text that says, meet me in the Vale, it's an emergency. Point of view shift. Perspective switches back to Fern, and she knows that Anu only agreed because he's trying to make her feel better, but she's determined. The two waste no time, things heat up very fast. But even when they are spicy, they are sweet, and they're being honest. They're being honest about everything except being in love with each other. But anyways, throughout the experience, saying, oh, this is what feels good, and what do you want? What do you need? At some point, whipped cream and chocolate syrup enter the chat, and this goes on for a lot of pages. The two get very creative before Anu does successfully knot Fern to the ecstatic bliss of them both, and Anu is just in shock and awe and just absolute sexy love. The two are now locked together for a bit, a forced cuddle because of the knot, and Fern starts to get all self-conscious, and Anu immediately picks up that her energy has now changed. Something's wrong, and he's like, what's wrong, babe? And she makes a self-deprecating joke. She's, well, at this angle that they're now locked together, it's not really flattering because of how it makes my tummy look. This is also what I'm talking about. If Fern can freely talk about her fears and insecurities, why can't they just, okay, never mind. Of course, Anu says the absolute naughtiest and most perfect thing about the whole situation that he could possibly say. Fern feels safe and happy again. The two finally separate, they get cleaned up, they say goodnight, and the text goes into italics to indicate that this is a thought and it's not spoken, but she in italics says, I love you, and then as she's drifting off to sleep, she swears she hears it back, but then she's, oh, it's just wishful thinking, and then she falls asleep. Anyways, POV switches back to Anu, who's living in perfect land with Fern all snuggled up against him. He finally sees Ender's text. He immediately knows, oh, okay, this is for real, for real. He doesn't want to leave Fern, but he knows something super serious is happening if Ender is asking him to meet immediately. So he kisses Fern, says, hey, I have to go help a friend, I'll be back ASAP. And she sleepily goes, okay, and falls back asleep. Anu goes outside to open a portal to the Veil, and we get some internal dialogue about the Veil as Anu enters it and how everyone experiences it differently. It's all very mystical. Anu thinks, I wish I could take Fern here, but you can't take a human to the Veil because it would mean death for them. Anu finds Ender, and Anu catches Ender up on the action on Earth of the last few hours about the burning house, arresting Chet. Ender offers to pay Chet a visit, and Anu says that Serafina would love that. And Ender goes, who? And Anu goes, oh, just Fern's best friend who's a seraphim. And then Ender's eyes flash red in the plot bunniest plot bunny, and we the readers now have a guarantee that we will get at least one more book. Ender and Anu switch to talking about Ender's text. Ender says, hey, I've been doing a lot of research. I went to Panama, found this bank account where all Fern's money has been embezzled to. He also found a social security box with something absolutely shocking inside, and Anu puts it together immediately. The offshore account is held by Fern's mom. Ender says, that's not all. Look at this letter that I found in the social security box. And Anu, whoa, that's an afterlife papyrus scroll, capital letter afterlife, capital letter papyrus, capital letter scroll. And it's the only paper in the world that cannot be destroyed. And Anu is, what? How is this here? Ender says, you've got to read it. And after hesitation, Anu does read it, and it turns out it's a letter from Fern's father saying how he wanted to make his wife happy. It was never enough. He tried to do his best for a daughter. He knows he failed Fern because Fern's mom convinced him that letting Fern know the truth about her heritage would quote-unquote damage her entire life. How he wanted to tell Fern the truth when he became sick and she was older, but that Fern's mom said that if her dad told her anything, she was not going to let Fern visit him in the hospital anymore. So Fern's dad then wrote this secret letter for Fern to get along with his will, which obviously she never did. And we don't know what the secret is yet, but we might be having some inklings at this point. Anu's absolutely enraged at this injustice that he figures out in this letter because it tells Fern a truth about who she is, and he recognizes that it's going to completely change the course of each other's future, and he's scared, but he says, I have to go back to Fern right now. POV switches to Fern, who's having a very naughty dream, and when Anu comes and wakes her up, she's like, sex please? And he says, yes, but we need to wait. I have this letter from your father that you were supposed to get when he died. Fern sees the letter and says, oh yeah, I've seen that. And Anu goes, do you know what's inside? Fern goes, well, actually, gasp, I'm dyslexic, and my mom read it to me. And then she comes clean to Anu. She explains her mother does all her reading. Anu asks her, what does the letter say? And Fern says that she wishes she could have read it, her father's goodbye, but she was too upset. She couldn't focus for months. Anu says, I want you to try to read it now. And Fern gets upset and says, no, Anu, I just explained it to you. I can't. I'm dyslexic. The words swim around. And Anu says, yeah, I know. I'm dyslexic too. And Fern just gasps, what do you mean? I've seen you read. And Anu says that's the difference between him and her, is that he was offered resources to help him. In fact, all Anubis children are offered these resources because it's an inherited trait. And Fern is really sad because she says the only person who ever knew was my mom. She told me to keep it a secret, that it would ruin everything, and I only just told Sarah for the first time days ago. And Anu breaks down and snuggles her because he knows she's been unjustly treated, and Fern is crying because she wants Anu to be hers, but he's not and never can be. And after a minute, Anu says there's a lot of advantages to dyslexia, like they're generally more observant than other people. It creates empathy for other people's struggles, and Fern needs to be able to recognize how successful she's been even without being able to read, and realize how strong and amazing she is. Fern asks Anu to read the letter now because she trusts him, and Anu says, okay, but you need to know this is super special paper. Anu reads the letter to her word for word. It's a lot of love from her dad, and then bomb drop truth, she has monster blood. Her great-great-grandmother on her dad's side was an Anubis. Apparently she married a Scotsman. Fern is far enough removed that she doesn't carry the physical traits of the Anubis anymore, but that she still has some of the genetic traits like dyslexia. And because monsters are different, quote unquote, when Fern's mom found out about all of this, she said that no one could ever know or even suspect because it would ruin Fern's life. And because Fern's dad had enough of the Anubis gene to have him have a mate bond, and because Fern's mom was his mate, he really did try to do everything he could to make her happy. But eventually he realized that Fern's mom was hurting Fern, so he really wanted to tell Fern but didn't know how. And this letter is to make sure that Fern knows someday, and maybe she'll have an even better life now that she knows. And Fern is just crushed because she's truly trying to accept the grief of how much her mom hurt her. And I wish right now that she would also, the book doesn't deal with this at all, but there's a level to where there should be anger and grief at her dad's inability to help her, but the book doesn't deal with that. But right now she's accepting the grief, her relationship with her mom. She feels anger, resentment, bitterness. Anu says, we're gonna get through this, like you and me. But Fern lashes out and says, there is no we. This has all been an elaborate lie to make my mom and shut back off, and now everything is burned, my life is a lie. And Anu's like, yeah, about the fact that you're part of Anubis, that actually changes everything. The book switches back to Anu's point of view, and he's, oh, she looks like she's gonna pass out. Anu feels awful, and he says, I'm so sorry, the second I lost control and bit you in the first 2 pages of the book, I sort of started the mating process. And he meant what he said, that it was involuntary. He was just really drawn to her, but he thought it was okay because she's human, so she wouldn't feel the mate bond, and he would be the only one aching for her. So, and he wasn't gonna force it on her without her consent. But then he bit her again, and then they had sex, and then he knotted her, and that means that they're fully mated. And now, no matter what, since for Anubis, she's gonna feel that ache to be with him now. He realizes, looking back, that it's him showing up at her door is probably triggered a latent heat in her, which is why they acted so bananas for each other right off the bat. He says, Fern, I'm sorry. And Fern asks, why are you sorry? And Anu says, because you weren't given the choice. And Fern says, finally, now that they're being honest, they're just like letting it all hang out. Fern says, well, what if I want to be with you? And Anu says, your feelings are tied to the mating link, which makes you want me. And Fern says, okay, I get what you're saying, but I'm telling you that even if none of this happened, I would still want you. I know I was complaining. I can kind of forgive the delay because the scene is really cute between them, and I understand that the author wanted build to this moment, but also notice how they're talking completely openly, freely, honestly with each other again, which again just highlights how weird it was when they were not talking. Fern says from moment one, Anu has made her feel safe and comfortable, which is more than just wanting him to be her sexy mate. She says he feels like home, and she says, you're the person my soul cries out for, and that she's been in denial over the last week about how much she needs him. Anu apparently can't function. His alpha is roaring in his head. Alpha takes over his body. He says mine, and Fern says yours, and then Anu's back in control and says, I need you right now. They try to get slow, but the two are like, can't. It's all very sweet. So they go at it, and then once they're done, they're kind of snuggling, and Anu hears his alpha sigh in his head, and he's like, oh, our cute little omega. And Anu realizes that his alpha is absolutely right, and even though Fern's blood is diluted, she's clearly an omega by how her body reacts to him and the fact that she can take a knot and all this stuff. Anu's alpha goes absolutely crazy and then reveals a latent breeding kink. Anu and Fern finally fall asleep, perfectly content. The end. Only nope, not the end. The point of view switches back to Fern, who is flying high because she's now mated to Anu. She figured that after Chet, she would never want anything like this again, but that Anu is her true mate on every level. The two are snuggled up and they're being mushy, and Fern goes, hey, we need to talk about my mom. Anu goes, uh-oh, and Fern goes, no, listen, I'm not dumb. I think if we could choose, I would never see her again, but I made a promise to my dad. And Anu's like, wait, what? When and what was the promise? And it turns out that Fern unknowingly made a death vow to her dad to take care of her mom and never leave her, which is why no matter how bad her mom has treated her, Fern has never had the ability to fully cut her off. And so a death vow is when one Anubis asks another Anubis to do something as like their final wish, and it's binding until one of the party members involved in the vow dies. And Fern says, wait, what? You mean I can't escape my mom until she dies? Anu says yes. And Fern says, hey, can you please put me back underneath your shirt? Anu says they can try to move a little bit farther away from Cedar Peak Heights to give Fern some space, but she can't get too far or she'll start to feel sick. Fern says, I do want the distance, but I also love this town. It's my home. Anu says, no problem. Let's stay here for a while. Let's finish your taxes. We have all the time in the world to figure out our next steps. Fern is feeling great. Anu says, I want you to visit Egypt with me and meet all my family. They're gonna love you. And they're happy, 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 sniggly, snuggle, snuggle, when the bedroom door of the cabin in the middle of the woods opens, and it's Fern's mother, and she's holding a gun. POV switches back to Anu, who sees that the gun is loaded, cocked, ready to fire, and it's also pointed directly at him. Anu's only thought is that he's just happy it's pointed at him and not Fern. Fern and his mom put the gun down. Fern's mom says, if you had just listened to me, then we would not be in this situation, and now Fern's mom has to fix everything. Anu recognizes that Fern's mom is way too gone, and this is confirmed when her mom starts ranting. It's like, don't you see, I'm just trying to help you. And Anu recognizes that Fern's mom genuinely believes what she's saying. She believes that by making Fern hide her dyslexia and by hiding her Anubis heritage, that she was trying to give Fern this nice normal life, and instead she has just made Fern miserable. Fern's mom tells Fern that this monster broke into her bank, stole a bunch of stuff, and Fern is like, wait, what? And then Anu goes, yeah, I was suspicious while I was doing your taxes, and I investigated, and that I found out that she's been embezzling your money, and that's also where I found this letter from your dad. Fern's mom immediately zeroes in on the fact that Anu was doing Fern's taxes. She realizes that Anu was gassed, the IRS auditor, all along. She then turns on Fern and says Fern is a whore for sleeping with someone she just met, let alone sleeping with a monster, and she's absolutely disgusted. She says she shouldn't be surprised because this is exactly what she told Fern's father would happen if Fern ever knew about her monster heritage, and she just says a whole bunch of awful stuff, and then she fires the gun. Things slow down for the narration, and Anu is fast enough to dodge the bullet, but he doesn't realize that Fern jumps in front of him to block it, and then she gets hit. Fern falls, she's dying. Her mother starts screaming. Anu grabs Fern, opens a portal to the veil because it's gonna slow the dying process and he can get her help there. Anu uses veil magic to fast travel to Ender's cottage, and he finds Ender and it begs him to save her, and Ender says she's too close to death and there's nothing that two death monsters can do, but someone who brings life could. Anu turns, jumps through another portal to Francine's house, runs inside, grabs Sarah. He just tells Sarah this is an emergency, and he pulls her into the veil, which she's never been to and doesn't know anything about. But Sarah, she sees Fern, she doesn't hesitate, she immediately goes to her. Anu quickly tells Sarah what happened. Sarah says, what can they do? And Ender says that Ender and Anu cannot help because they're entities of death, but Seraphim can bring life. And Anu begs Sarah. Sarah says, I've never wanted this, I've avoided it, but I would die for Fern. Ender coaches Sarah through how to feel for Fern's life force, and Sarah manages to save Fern, and in doing so, Sarah gets her wings. The process is very painful for Sarah, and apparently the size of the life given equals the size of the wings, and Sarah's wings are absolutely huge. Anu barely pays attention though because Fern is breathing again, she's starting to wake up. The point of view switches back to Fern, who's having a dream about blood, but she wakes up to Anu holding her. She starts to ask what happened, but then she hears someone in pain, and she looks over and she sees Sarah on the ground and Ender leaning over her. Fern asks, what's going on? Anu goes, that's Sarah, that's Ender, but Fern can't remember what happened, and Ender says, well, that's normal because you died. And Fern's like, what? And Anu says it's the most beautiful sound he's ever heard, and he's nuzzling her, and Fern's like, what? And he says, your heartbeat, I can hear your heartbeat. Anu gently tells the story of the last few minutes, and Fern's like, you keep saying I died, but I don't understand, I'm here, I'm alive. Ender explains what Seraphina did, and Fern starts to cry because she knows that Sarah never wanted this, never wanted to get her wings, but Ender says that Sarah made a choice out of love, and Anu says that Sarah didn't do anything for Fern that Fern wouldn't have done for Sarah. And even though Fern knows she would have done anything to save Sarah, she can't stop crying because she knows what it means. She knows that Sarah's in a lot of pain now. Ender says, yes, she's in pain now because her bones are reforming, but Sarah will eventually learn how to fly. Fern asks about her mother, and Anu says, your mother's on Earth, Ender's already called the police on her. Fern feels like she should be sad and even thinks about how she should feel sick because she won't be able to keep her promise to her dad, but she realizes for the first time ever she doesn't feel this pull between her mom and her. I think that that's such an interesting detail, and I wish that the author had kind of mentioned mentioned that earlier in that book. I mean, it would have been a very obvious plot bunny, but it would have been nice to get like little glimpses of Fern like wrestling with the desire to pull away from her mom, but the inability. I think that would have made the whole like Dead Sea Scroll thing less of a Deus Ex Machina type of moment. But she asks Anu, did I really die? And Anu says, that's what Ender says. Fern goes, well, that means that I fulfilled my death vow. And Anu's, oh man, you're right, because it only holds as long as one of you is alive. You're finally free of her. So even with all the trauma, Fern feels absolutely euphoric. She is no longer tied to someone who has spent her whole life hurting her. Sarah finally starts to pick herself up. Fern crawls over to her. They're both covered in blood. They're embracing. They're loving each other. After a minute, Fern says, I want to get out of here, get cleaned up. And Anu says, of course you'll come with me. Sarah's going to stay with Ender for a bit to feel better. And Sarah goes, no, I'm not. And Ender goes, yes, you are. You're too weak and inept with your wings. And Fern is floored that he would speak to Sarah like that. Anu says, don't worry, Ender's a good guy. And Fern goes, I'm not worried about Sarah. I'm worried about Ender. Ender and Anu start to say some cute things to each other. And Fern thinks to herself, they say, oh gosh, they say nothing is certain but death and taxes, but I'll be damned if the two didn't bring me my happily ever after. And if that's not the cutest damn thing ever, then I don't know what is. The POV switches back to Anu. It's labeled 1 month later. It's an epilogue. It's Thanksgiving. Anu has never celebrated Thanksgiving before. He and Fern are putting out food, and Fern has made 16 desserts, which he thinks about dessert, and he starts to think about all the things that he and Fern like to do with food, and he gets all snuggly with Fern, who says that you need to behave because our guests are coming over. So just then Francine comes in. Sarah's on her way. Anu is thinking, wow, Fern made a lot of food for just 4 people, but then ding dong, Anu opens the door, and his parents are there along with his sisters, his nieces, his nephews, his brother-in-law, his whole family's out on the front doorstep. Anu's mom is happy Thanksgiving, surprise, and even though his family has never celebrated it once, they're all about it. Fern says surprise, and Anu is just overwhelmed. He grabs her, he kisses her, and then Fern turns to his parents and says, hi, Mr. and Mrs. Napa, I'm Fern, and they're like, call me mom and dad, and Fern starts to tear up, and then Anu's sisters grab Fern and they pull her off to start talking, and it's like a super sweet, lovey party. When they finally have a second to themselves, Anu tells Fern how lucky and happy he is, and Fern says, yeah, I can't believe that I was able to do this. I did most of the reading of the emails between you and your family, and Sarah only helped me a little bit. And Anu's like, oh, you're just the most amazing. A little while later, Anu gets a text from Ender that says, hey, I'm waiting outside. Anu slips out. Ender says, I need your help kidnapping Sarah and bringing her to the Veil. And Anu is like, wait, what? Hold on. Fern comes out and is, hi, Ender. And Anu says, we'll talk about this later. But Fern goes, talk about what? Ender says, hey, I need to kidnap Sarah. Anu thinks that Fern is gonna rip into Ender, but Fern just starts laughing and says, yeah, sure, of course, and Anu will help. And Anu is, wait, what? And Fern goes, it'll be good for Sarah and Ender. Fern and Anu go back inside. They get kissy kissy, sexy sexy, and they live happily ever after. And that is the very in-depth spoiler summary of Audited by the Anubis. And now we are going to turn to an analysis of some of the major themes and depictions of the book. So now we're going to dive into the analysis portion of Audited by the Anubis. I'm going to talk about some of the key themes that the book touches on and just kind of my own thoughts and reflections about how the book dealt with them. The first one, and probably one of the most prominent throughout the book, is body autonomy and positive sexuality as represented in the book. The text explicitly centers female pleasure. It's essential. It's not secondary. Anu focuses on Fern's pleasure repeatedly throughout the book. He takes pleasure in being able to give her pleasure. And this, for me, really challenges heteronormative scripts where male pleasure seems to dominate. And what I mean by that is that when I was younger and I was reading romance novels that I had picked up from Safeway or Rayleigh's, oftentimes the way that female pleasure was portrayed in those texts was that the male and the female would come together. The woman would achieve orgasm just through the act of having sex with her partner. There was no external stimulation of anything. Like he might bite her neck, he might, kiss her chest, but there was nothing else. That script right there, that really centers male pleasure because it is much easier for men to achieve orgasm orgasm through just the sexual intercourse part of sexual intercourse. It wasn't until I would say decades later that I would encounter in books a man who was willing to use his mouth or his fingers. And even then, it was only just to warm up the situation. It's very recently, like 2017, 2016 maybe, that there became a much bigger focus with having the woman have multiple orgasms, have her orgasm before sex, have her orgasm during sex. Again, I want to remind everyone that this is women, more often than not, this is women writing for women. So this was how women were representing female pleasure to other women. I'm sure some of that also had to do with what's it called in comic books, but like not censorship, but like quality standards. Like compliance standards. I can't remember what it's called, but where they're like the media gets reviewed and they go, oh no, that's super crossing a line there. Here's where the line is. You can go right up to it, but you can't go past it. So I don't know how much of this evolution of representation of female pleasure has to do with those quality standards that were being imposed on romance novels. But it took women's pleasure a long time to catch up. I would even say I read more romance novels that referenced or explicitly stated a blowjob on a man years before I encountered a man doing that to a woman. So that is something that I really like about this book, is that it's like another step in that evolution. Is it's not only making sure that Fern gets her pleasure multiple times, it's that Anu he gets just as hot and heavy for Fern getting hot and heavy as when he finally gets his own. And even like the next evolution of that is the fact that Fern makes this like huge mess when she does achieve orgasm. And that is definitely something I haven't encountered that in text until I would say 2024 was maybe late 23 was the first time that I ever encountered something where the woman was like, oh my god, I've made this mess everywhere, and then the man was like, I love that you made this mess. It's really nice because for me it's normalizing also that everybody's body is different. Like literally every body is different. Not only will everybody achieve pleasure in different ways, but everybody's body will express pleasure in different ways. And so much about how I'm starting to think about those early 2000 comics like Dane Cook, who would make whole jokes about the sounds or different positions that like a woman, like really using women trying to achieve pleasure and like the natural things that happen in our body. I can remember Dane Cook making that the butt of several jokes, and I remember that experience of me suddenly being like, oh no, that's embarrassing, and I developed self-consciousness and embarrassment. I don't know if it ever got to the point of shame, but I became very self-conscious about my body in expressing anything. You see that directly being challenged in this particular book, which I really like. One last note about positive sexuality and specifically bodily autonomy in this particular text is that you see, even though Fern and Anu are immediately drawn to each other, that they still are constantly negotiating their consent. Even after they have had sex, Anu tells his alpha, arousal does not equate to acceptance. So Anu knows that just because he had that experience once, it doesn't mean that he is automatically granted that experience again. I love that so much. The thing where this book gets a little bit tricky, and I do not think it handles it the best way possible, is the mate bond. And the mate bond is a very common trope, especially in any sort of werewolf, shifter, monster romance style setting. I actually just last night was reading, they have those apps that have those really just cheeseball, probably AI generated texts in them, like Good Novel. And I love the ad for Good Novel is find good novels on Good Novels, or Galatea, however you pronounce it, where it's like they're basically nothing but like werewolf, shifter, fated mate, really fast read, trash for your brain books. So mate bonding is like very common. I think that particular trope which I do love. I don't know necessarily that it works in this book. It has so much to say around consent in the mate bond trope, and it kind of undermines some of their ability to consent in a way that I don't think fits well in this book. It specifically, Fern's arousal, and this is explicitly stated later on in the book, Fern's arousal is partially biological and partially magical. It's rather than her purely autonomous choice. Now, I do not mind or have problems with the idea of, fated mates going into heat or rut or whatever that is, as long as it's consensual, of course. Here, and I admit, I do enjoy that opening scene of this book where she opens the door and they both just automatically, they can't keep their hands off of each other. I think it's a very cute scene. I think it works. I think it's a smexy scene. I think it might be out of place. Let me take that back. I think it is out of place amongst all the other messaging in this book. And I think the text knows this well because they do attempt to address it once or twice throughout the rest of the book. They do attempt to address this by having the characters discuss, are our feelings real or are they bond induced? Is my attraction real or is it this magical supernatural force? Was my magical biological side responsible for me biting you and taking away your consent, when everything else about that opening scene is consent? It's Anu is trying so hard to be a gentleman, Fern is trying so hard to control herself, and then they both just lose complete control. And by biting her in that moment and initiating the mate bond, even though we don't know Fern has Anubis blood at that point, the rest of the book does come into question. Legitimately, are their feelings for each other real? And yes, Fern does say at the end of the book that even without the bond, Anu's the best man that she ever met. And she got really lucky. She got really lucky that Anu was Anu and not another Chet. And I think the book knows that. And I think it wanted to toe the line of the Omegaverse, which has a lot more problematic representations of heat and rut and mate bonding tropes and whatnot. I think it wanted to dip its toe into that pool while also trying to comment on that pool. And I don't know necessarily that it was successful. Another big topic within this book is body image and internal body image versus external body image. So something that this book does really well is it directly confronts fat phobia through Fern's kind of internalized shame about and around her body. And I think that this book does something really well, which is it doesn't explicitly state it, but it is very clear that Fern has body dysmorphia, because she went in the scene where she is trying on clothes in front of Sarah. Sarah holds up a dress and Fern goes, "There's no way that will ever fit me." Sarah goes, "No, try it on, trust me." And then it fits her, and Fern, it only fits her, but Fern's shocked by how good she looks in it. So that for me begs the question, what size is Fern in this book? Now, on the cover, she looks like a perfectly normal size. She looks like she might be a size 12, maybe a 14. Her mother, the way her mother speaks about her, would have you believe that she's a much larger size than that. And the way Anu talks about her, the way Sarah talks about her, there's a clear disconnect between what those three parties are seeing. And you do tend to side with Anu and Sarah because they are on Fern's side. Fern herself, though, describes herself as being curvy, wanting to lose a couple extra pounds. I think it's supposed to imply that she is large because she sat at home and she baked a bunch of cookies and then she ate them by herself, which even in the book, it tries to say this. It's that in and of itself is not fat, or it's not fat behavior, but also there's a read of this book where even Fern is well, I am fat, so that is why I ate this many cookies. And then that is then reinforced by what her mom says. So not only does Fern have dysmorphia around what her body actually looks like, she also likely has a lot of internal commentary on the food that she's consuming. Though, interestingly enough, that doesn't ever come up again in the text. Like, for example, when she goes to eat with Anu, you don't get any internal dialogue that's like, oh, I should have a salad because I am fat, because I need to lose weight, or I should not enjoy my... There's no other else in the book does Fern indicate that she does not enjoy eating. It's only in that very opening scene. And I think that that is done to establish that she is not the standard body type because she engages in these behaviors. Now, the book does confront this. Sarah confronts Fern's mom, and Anu directly confronts Fern, telling her that he finds Fern desirable as she is. Anu doesn't ever say, I find you perfectly sexy at your size. What he says is, I just find you sexy. So again, we don't really know what size Fern is. Honestly, the way that Fern's mom acts, she could be a size 6, she could be a size 8, and I'm thinking about American sizes. She could even possibly be a size 2. We don't know, because Fern's that internalized body dysmorphia comes directly from her mother, who weaponizes it as a form of control and likely has done her entire life. And then it was just reinforced by her ex-husband Chet. Her mother calling her a fat cow and monitoring her eating would mess up anybody's self-concept. I really appreciate that this book does address the fat phobia and the body. Even as I'm saying it, I really enjoy that the book makes it clear that the fat phobia is coming from the villain in the story. Also, that the book never makes weight loss or anything surrounding that conversation part of Fern's empowerment arc, but it does also seem like a bit of a non-starter of the conversation. It's kind of like one more thing that's just layered on top of the other themes that this text talks about, and it feels like it's set up to be something much bigger than it ever winds up being. We do see towards the end of the book, Fern is still self-conscious about, she's in a position that makes her stomach stick out and she's uncomfortable with it, and Anu tells her again, like, I find you so sexy no matter what position you're in. And so we do see external forces wanting to give Fern a new internal monologue, but I don't think it ever gets brought up again past that scene. So not only is, weight loss isn't part of her empowerment arc, but she also never confronts anyone. She's challenged, but she never then takes that challenge, and then we have no evidence that she believes it, I think is what I'm trying to say. We have no evidence. And you could have had a very quick scene where, from Fern's point of view, where she catches a look at herself in the mirror, and for like the very first time in the whole book, she actually sees herself. She sees what maybe it could have been like, and Anu and Fern could see what Anu saw, and she like rubs her hips, and she like loves the way the dress like sits on her, or just something like where we see her looking at herself and believing the challenging words that Anu and Sarah have been giving her. I don't think that the book sets that up, but I don't think it ever fully manifests it as a complete theme. That line is just, it's like the sock on the laundry pile of stuff that Fern's mom is dumping on Fern. And as I'm processing this also, I think part of my issue with this is that Fern's body is mainly validated through Anu's attraction. It's validated through this external male attraction rather than her own experience within her body. She does get a little bit more confidence, but that's what I was trying to say. We never see her owning her own body, and that's where I think that this particular theme falls short. Let's talk about dyslexia and disability. Now, I want to be completely clear. The first time I read this, I was like, dyslexia? Is that what? I mean, of all the disabilities, that seems like a minor one, especially because there's a later book where the main heroine has MS and is in a wheelchair. And this same author, Wendi Guff, goes into much more in depth about living with this chronic pain and her mobility and stuff like that. So when I thought about dyslexia, I was like, oh, okay. And then I also thought about the fact that I have ADHD related dyslexia. So sometimes my brain just moves too fast. I switch around words, it's around numbers a lot. I've always struggled with math because of that. I'll transpose numbers constantly, but it's never been like a deep challenge for me. But then I was in conversation with someone over this last weekend about glasses. Out of nowhere, I said, glasses are a disability, aren't they? Like they're when you think about, all of the cuts that are being made to, I can't think of what the bill is, but there are certain states in the American United States that are trying to challenge, I think, it's the 504. It's like the 504 process that allows, it makes it so schools and businesses have to give you accommodations to help you achieve. So for example, if you have ADHD and you need to take a walk around or you need a fidget or something like that to help you focus, you can have those things during a test. That's a very mild example of that. Several states are trying to challenge that, and it could potentially mean things like they don't need to offer, like airlines don't need to offer any sort of accommodation if you're in a wheelchair or a walker or anything like that. And it clicked in my brain that glasses are an accommodation for what it can be classified, what is actually a disability. But I think it's become so normalized in our society that we don't think about glasses or we don't think about poor eyesight as a disability. But for literally thousands of years, having an astigmatism, being nearsighted, which I am, would have meant life or death. You would not have been able to participate as much in society because you could not see as well. And I was thinking about the book by Catherine something, but it's Catherine called Birdie is the book, and then the author I think is also named Catherine. I'm really sorry, I'm not looking it up right now. But in the book Catherine called Birdie talks about she has poor eyesight and she has to squint all the time. And there's this scene in the book that for whatever reason I've always remembered, where they're cleaning the fleas out from the bed and they lay out a white sheet, and Birdie will squint and look for the little black moving dots, and she'll grab them and she'll squeeze them, and then they're dead and then they're gone. And that's an actual representation of what it probably would have been like to be a lower nobility, upper middle class merchant's daughter in this medieval time period. And it just clicked to myself, though, that the use of glasses has become so normalized that we don't think about the fact that for literally thousands of years, eyesight would have been a massive hindrance if you were trying to hunt something. It would have been a massive hindrance if you were trying to tell from far away whether or not a clump of trees was going to yield the fruit that you want. When I started thinking about with dyslexia and stuff, it's become so normalized, at least in my brain, and I feel like in the rest of American society, dyslexia is so normalized that it's become like it's like the use of psychology words through just on TikTok. It's like, oh, I'm a bit dyslexic, and they don't mean, or OCD. That's what I'm trying to think of. It's like, oh, I'm a bit OCD. It's not that OCD isn't that you just like to have things set in a certain way. It's that you have an actual like fear in your body that if everything on your desk isn't at exact right angles, then there's like an intense belief that you are a bad person, or that if you don't triple check that the door is locked, you don't lock it once, twice, thrice, then something horrible will happen to someone you love. Like that is what one of the varieties of OCD manifests as. And I was thinking about with dyslexia, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe not hundreds and hundreds, for hundreds of years, at least since the beginning of the public education system or any sort of education system that involved a schoolroom, anyone who had dyslexia would have been labeled as not being intelligent. Their struggle would not have been recognized as something that could be overcome or that could be trained or could be scaffolded for. They likely would have just been shunted off to the side as, oh, well, they're just a little slow. And when I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about the normalization of dyslexia in American culture and the way that it just kind of gets tossed around the same way as OCD does, and we don't think about it in the way that glasses is, I all of a sudden it really like struck home with me. No, Fern's dyslexia is truly a disability, and Fern has done what so many others have done, which is she has learned to operate in a system that does not accommodate her. Now she's got more going on. She has fears. She has this internal shame that's brought on by her mother, but voice to text speech. Voice to text is a scaffold for someone who knows, like, I know that I have ADHD, so I do certain things to scaffold, to accommodate me, to make sure I'm comprehending, to make sure I'm understanding. And I've also gotten very comfortable making a nuisance of myself and like asking the same questions 3 times, being like, listen, I just need to like quadruple check. This is what you said, right? Because my attention will just, it's not a memory thing, it's an attention thing. My brain will just cut off a line of thought and move on to another line of thought, and there's no crumbs to help me get back to where I was. Voice to text is like, imagine if Fern had been able to, instead of sitting there struggling to read this contract, what if she had just gone, oh, I'm going to use my voice to text reader, and then she could listen to it. But she doesn't even know that's an option. The book doesn't even present that as an option. It very much makes it so Fern is reliant first on her mother and then on Sarah, and then she trains herself, and she's got help from Anu. She's got these people in her life, but there are tools that have been invented and have been integrated into our society to allow people with these disabilities to integrate so seamlessly that it doesn't even register that dyslexia is a disability anymore. And that was kind of, I've read this book, let me think, hold on, wait, I read it and I loved it, and then I reread it just for fun, and then I reread it for this podcast, and then I retold it. I reviewed it again before the analysis section. So let's just say 5 times I've read this book. And it was only on the most recent work through of the book that it finally clicked in my brain. Fern's dyslexia is what Sarah says is true. Her mother not supporting her and not is cruel, and it is child abuse. Literally, everybody's got a cell phone in this book. They call each other on each other's cell phone. Voice to text apps, I've been using them for 20 plus years. I used to use them when I was in my undergraduate work so I could listen to all of the papers that I would have. My professors were requiring me to read for my homework. I would take the PDF and I'd put it through a voice to text reader. Fern's struggle becomes so much sadder and more impactful when you really comprehend how much her mother, who's that lady? Gypsy Rose? It's like Fern's mother might as well have been modeled after Claudine Blanchard, who was Gypsy Rose's mother. Claudine Blanchard told her daughter that she had this horrific illness to control her, to limit her life. And something that I think that this book, it does it again in the same way of the fat phobia, is Fern's validation of her dyslexia. It comes from her love interest. It comes from male validation. Yes, Sarah is supportive and Sarah's like, I'm right there with you, but it's not until Anu normalizes this neurodivergence, basically says it's an inherited trait of your own genetics, reframing this as a very common difference and not the deficit that her mother has, the ableist shame that her mother has dropped on her. I appreciate that. I'm trying to like work through my thoughts. I do this every time. I appreciate that the disability is linked to genetics, and it's genetics that decided this is how your brain is going to work. And I appreciate that a lot because of my own diagnosis with both depression and ADHD. I found so much comfort in this isn't something I'm doing to myself. There is literally nothing wrong. This is just what my genes are doing to me. And once I was able to get distance, I put distance between myself and the symptoms of what my genetics do. It really, like, I took huge leaps forward in my own healing and acceptance and the accommodations that I was willing to give to myself and the grace that I was willing to give to myself. I like that the text links it to genetics. It's almost like, in some ways, it could be read that this is something that connects her back to her father and her father's mother, all the way back in time. It shows that she's part of this culture through her genes, which is very much something that psychologists are showing more and more every year, that we are products of something that happened to our thrice great grandmothers over 150 years ago. I do like that. I don't know that Anu should be the source of all her healing, because she does have this great relationship with Sarah, but at the end of the day, Anu, I'm stumbling over my words. She's known Sarah for a long time, but she doesn't even start to try to heal until Anu comes into her life. She doesn't try to push back and to reframe until Anu is there. And I think, with the fat phobia, with the dyslexia, with the abuse, all of that is very much, Fern gains velocity around healing around it because of a romantic interest. I just think that you have this set up very strong friendship, and repeatedly throughout the book, Sarah is willing to do something that she swore she would never do in order to save Fern's life. You have this really strong female friendship representation. It would have been nice if Fern maybe had been working on these things before Anu showed up. It would have been really nice if maybe we had got, the opening scene is, it's the catch, it's the hook, it's all that stuff. But it would have been really nice if we'd gotten something like, maybe this book could have opened with Fern leaving Sarah at the bakery so she could go home early, baking cookies and sitting down eating them, watching Bridgerton, and then Anu shows up. And maybe Sarah saying like, don't forget today, Fern, your homework is not to listen to that voice inside your head that says you don't deserve rest. I'm not entirely sure what this would have looked like. I just know that what the book did was it put the impetus for healing 100% on the romantic relationship. That's not how it works. That's just not how it works. Okay, let's wrap up that. Points for representing a disability, points for helping me to get a deeper understanding of disability and the normalization of the acceptance and normalization of some disabilities. Actually, before I forget, there's a book I want to recommend to everybody. I'm pulling it up right now on my phone. It is called The Other Side of History, Daily Life in the Ancient World, and it is by Robert Garland. It's one of the great courses series. I love this book because it is a scholar who they talk about the poor, the elderly, children, the disabled. They talk about those people that do not get represented in the Odyssey. They don't get represented in the Enuma Elish. And the book talks about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Persia, I think one other country but that was a really important book for me. So that way, as an English major, when I would start to read like Wuthering Heights, I had this new lens that I was like, okay, well, what about this sick person? Oh my gosh, this book, like think about Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester's first wife, and the Wide Sargasso Sea. What about the characters that are being shunted off to the side and used as a plot point rather than being granted full humanity? This book right here, Audited by the Anubis, a monster romance, I need to give it its flowers for deepening my recognition of acceptable versus unacceptable disabilities in American society. That's my pin in that topic. Let's talk about abuse. So the abuse, the abuse is heavy in this book. We do see a little bit of it in action, but we mostly see the fallout of the abuse. So something this book does is it names the abuse specifically. Sarah names this as child abuse. When Sarah says that Fern's mom not getting Fern help was child abuse, it's like, say it louder for those in the back. Yes, that is child abuse. And specifically, this book also says something. Sarah says, your mother masks cruelty as concern, which is, Manipulator Handbook 101. That's like chapter 1, page 1. That's the chapter that comes right before it wasn't as bad as you thought it was. That's asking cruelty as concern is, I got that all the time as a kid of, well, we're just trying to help you fit in. That's actually probably something Fern's mom did say to her, and that is 100% something my mom said to me. My mom never was never mind. Let's not hold on. You guys are not my therapist. I'll save that for my next appointment. So there's the naming of abuse. Fern's mother's actions and behavior are labeled as abuse. I really like that there is no physical abuse in the text. So for example, Fern says that Chet never got to the point of laying hands on her, but his verbal cruelty and her mom's verbal cruelty are taken as seriously as physical abuse. Something that the book does is abuse, but the book doesn't, I think, actively name as abuse is the financial abuse that Fern is under. I think financial abuse is a plot point that gets used a lot in these texts, but maybe never named as financial abuse, and it plays a huge issue in power dynamics, as we will see in the next book that we talk about. Oftentimes, though, that abuse comes from the romantic partner, and in this book, the financial abuse comes from her mom. Her mom's not only just stealing from her, it's basically the success or not success of her business is entirely reliant on her mom properly performing the business aspects that have to happen behind the scenes, specifically around the reading aspect of it. Then there's much more explicit financial abuse when her mother, who has stolen this money, says, I will give you the money if you get back together with your ex-husband for essentially the sake of appearances, which is a plot point that gets used a lot. That blackmailing leverage finance plot point, that gets used a lot in a lot of romance novels, and it gets played for, isn't this a cheeky thing that this, I mean, oh my gosh, Mr. Rochester does that to Jane Eyre when he refuses to pay her, and then Edward in The Raven Prince, who is basically Mr. Rochester, does that to Anna. There's essentially the same book. The book explicitly calls out the abuse, it represents the abuse, it doesn't shy away from this abuse and then also the trauma that it creates. It does something a little bit more than that though, which is actually literalizes, it externalizes the actual abuse bond, the trauma bond that forms between the abused and the abuser, which is in the form of the death vow. For Fern's dad, it would have been his mate bond, but for Fern herself, it's this death vow that is very representational of there is something that happens to us. I can't speak about the why. I can just speak that if you know, you know. For there is no just leaving. There is no just cut them off. There's not. That doesn't exist. When you have been abused for a very long time and you have essentially been isolated, and it's a person who is in a very precious position in your life, a mother, father, a husband, a sibling, that bond that forms between the abuser and the abused, it is a potent thing that is incredibly hard to sever completely. This is years upon years upon years, and that bond is the neural connections in our brain that have taught us a story about ourselves and our place and our worthiness that has been forged. And anyone who has done the work, is doing the work, knows that unfortunately those neural connections are very easy to create, and they are almost impossible to break. So the death vow is almost an actual literal externalization of the trauma bond that Fern has to her mother. She cannot leave her mom. It's not due to her own weakness. In this instance, it's due to magical coercion, which I've got so many problems with Fern's dad. Don't get me started on Fern's ineffectual father. Like, oh my goodness. Nope. Walk away. Fern doesn't leave not due to weakness, but through what is essentially magical coercion, which I think is a really nice literary for the actual way abuse rewire your brain. And in the fact that Fern can't leave or she'll feel sick. I mean, that nausea, the sickness, that's the somatic symptoms for the anxiety that you feel in the twisting in your gut and the tightness in your chest, the almost but not quite panic attack of you go maybe a week or two without having this trigger happen to you, and then all of a sudden you see the person's name calling you and you're right back to where you were. Doesn't matter, you're back in it. You're not outside of it anymore. So I really liked that. What I didn't like was how the death vow is broken. Oh my gosh. Can we talk about the fact that Fern appears to suffer no mental damage from the fact her mom shot her? And yes, it was an accident. Her mom didn't mean to shoot her. She meant to shoot the person that Fern loves. But her mom shoots her, and her mom shoots her right after she calls her a whole bunch of really nasty names. There's also no psychic damage from the fact, like comprehending the fact that she died. She died. This is literally just a plot point of, oh, my mom shot me, I dead, the bond is now resolved, and I can go on and live happily ever after with my super cute, sweet monster husband. I don't know how to react to that. Even like the first time I read this book, I was like, huh, all right. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that after decades, like 30 years of being mentally beat down, your mother shoots you and you die? Okay, walking away. So while I really like the death vow, it is used as a deus ex machina. It is used as a device to just wrap up the final little plot point. I felt the same way about just Chet getting arrested off stage. Chet's arrested. I know it's a cozy romance. It's a cozy romance. I have to keep telling myself this is a cozy romance, because do you know how many times Fern is about to get re-traumatized by having to go through the court systems? She's gonna have to face her ex-husband. She's gonna have to face her mom in court. She's gonna have to tell the story again and again and again. But none of that's even referenced. It's like when it, just like maybe like a sentence that's like, oh, the week after Thanksgiving, man, we have that deposition, but I've got Anu and Sarah by my side. No, maybe this is just, I don't know. I don't know. What? So in addition to there being no fallout, let's talk about Fern's mom. Fern's mom is narcissistic, she is controlling, she's racist, she's misogynistic, and she is misogynistic in the way that women teach misogyny to each other. That actually, now that I said that out loud, it's really shocking that Fern came out of this as healthy as she did, because Fern has no shame about having sexual relationships outside of marriage or with someone from another species. That's kind of the biological aspect of her being part Anubis. So it'd be interesting if she wasn't part Anubis. But Fern's mom is misogynistic. She reinforces patriarchal standards. Like, they talk about it in terms of, I've never seen someone who is so obsessed with what other people thought as your mother. That is being aware of, I just learned this word, I love it, the panopticon. And specifically, this is the patriarchal panopticon. Pan being everything, opticon being like watching. The panopticon is like you are always being watched, which is something that we 100%, we've given up our souls to in the age of social media, is we're like, please watch me. That's the panopticon. And Fern's mother is clearly someone who is aware of the outside gaze of others, and she's aware of it in a way that is what it would be considered societally acceptable within very strict patriarchal rules. That's why I'm naming what she's saying is misogyny. She's very aware of what would be considered like the traditional, like that kind of 1950s fantasy version of what a woman should appear as in public. Put together only dating what's appropriate, dating outside of your species, obviously not dating outside your species, not dating outside of your race is what I meant to say. She's this very villainous character, but there's zero exploration of her victimization. You do not become that in a vacuum. We can infer that Fern's dad, when he met her, Fern's mom, which I've read this book so many times. Does Fern's mom even have a name? I know she's Miss Maven, but I don't know what her name is, so I'm just going to call her Fern's mom. When Fern's dad meets Fern's mom, it appears from Fern's memory of discussions that she was already fully realized as this villainous self, that she likely already had these ideas about what was appropriate or inappropriate. Here's a great question. Did Fern's mom know that her soon-to-be spouse, her fiance, was part Anubis before or after she married him? At what point did Fern's dad let that be known? Would Fern's mom have consented to that marriage if she knew Fern's dad was part monster and that she would give birth to a part monster? She doesn't seem like the type of person who would do that. I hate Fern's dad so much. That's a question that I've had almost every single time I've read this book. maybe not the first time when I was just like speed reading it, but once you start to look at Fern's mom, you realize that she is one-dimensional. There's no rhyme or reason behind what she's doing besides the fact that she is trying to uphold this very strict public image. What happened to her? What happened to her? And that Fern's mom is the perfect example of why I want to do this podcast, because romance novels are, or have been, this is changing a lot. Romance novels have, for the most part, been straight women writing for straight women. And it is, like I was talking earlier about female pleasure, we are teaching our next generation what is romantic. We are teaching them what's acceptable in a relationship. We're teaching them, they're learning from these books. We all learned from these books. Where did Fern's mom learn this? How long has this been passed down in her lineage before she finally got to a cycle breaker in Fern? I don't know, because we don't get any. We know she abuses Fern. We know Fern carries extreme mental trauma and also physical trauma. Maybe even just a reference to now Fern's got a scar on her chest that Anu likes to lick. I don't know, but there could have been some acknowledgement that Fern was shot in the chest by her mom. We got no examination of her. Would that have kept this as a cozy book? I don't know. But it's moments like this that we have to look at the source of the abuse and then look behind the source of the abuse. And by doing that, we can identify the systems that have been set up for us to continue to put restraints on ourselves and on our own children about what roles we're supposed to be playing in society. And I think that, the fact that Fern's mom became so desperate that she was willing to get Chet to attempt murder. Chet didn't know Fern was in that house. And we know Fern's mom was the one controlling Chet. Like he was saying things like, let me handle it. I'll get you your wife back. You deserve my daughter. My daughter needs to be with you. Fern's mom comes to Fern's house and drives Chet off. We know she is the one that is controlling things. So Fern's mom attempts murder on Fern even before shooting her in the chest. Because she burns Fern's house down thinking that Fern's car is in the front and that Fern must be there. Now she does it through Chet. But she does it she sends Chet to burn down the bakery, knowing that Sarah lives above it. So she's fully capable of murder. She just fails twice. What got her to the point? I'm going to be thinking about this for months. What got her to the point where she was okay burning her own daughter alive to save face? Okay, let's move on. We're going to talk about emotional justice. And does Audited by the Anubis, is it an emotionally just book? I want to make sure we're all on the same page. What is emotional justice? This is a theory. This was really propounded by scholars like Audre Lorde. It's been used by activists, specifically Black female activists, Black female scholars, to refer to their right to feel and express the full range of human emotion and to do it without being punished. Black women are not allowed to express anger in our society, in American society. It's the recognition that marginalized people are denied emotional expression and also oftentimes are being forced to manage others' emotions. The white woman's tears. I just read a children's book. It was from the point of view of a little child who had moved from Mexico to America. And one of the pages, it said, at home, referring to Mexico, we give handshakes, hugs, and kisses to everyone. But here, referring to America, handshakes are for new people, hugs and kisses are only for special people. And I thought that was such a beautiful and also very simple and effective example of how marginalized people, they're denied their full emotional expression, especially when it's part of their culture and it happens so they can fit into this culture. Emotional justice is teaching that healing from emotional abuse, your feelings are valid. That pain that you're feeling at the hands of the system, it's valid. It's about trying to think about how we create conditions where people can honor their own emotional needs, my emotional needs, your emotional needs, without shame. Now, this concept, this term, as mentioned in the introduction of these episodes, I use this term specifically, I use this lens specifically because this is the definition of what a romance novel is, and it specifically says lovers are rewarded with emotional justice. That is why I'm bringing this specific lens to romance novels. Here are the 4 questions that I like to ask to decide whether or not a book is granting the lovers an emotionally just ending. 1. Are emotional wounds acknowledged and addressed? 2. Is justice achieved for those who have been wronged? 3. Are power balances meaningfully confronted and rectified? And 4. Do characters grow in a way that promote emotional equity? So, question 1. Are emotional wounds acknowledged and addressed? Acknowledged, yes. Explicitly, repeatedly. The text names emotional harms, the emotional abuse. Your mom is cruel to be kind. Body-based trauma, her fat phobia, years of being called a fat cow. Fern's disability-based shame, her mother's financial abuse of her mother's gaslighting of her mother's isolation of her. Now, most of these harms center around Fern, and most of this, all of this conversation has centered around Fern. Anu does have an emotional wound that gets acknowledged and addressed, which is that Anu is under the understanding and expectation that he has to be a certain way because he's an alpha, and Fern deals with that immediately. She's just like, have you ever heard of a switch? And then Anu's like, oh dang, no, I've never heard of a switch. I guess I'm that now. And boom, he's healed. Acknowledged and addressed in a moment. Now, does the text address Fern's laundry list of emotional harm or emotional wounds? Sort of. I guess it depends on your definition of addressed. Like I said, Fern's freedom comes through her dying at the hands of her mother, which is not even an emotional wound that is acknowledged, which is a total deus ex machina. She wants to leave her mom, but she doesn't get to choose to leave her mom. She's bound and then she's murdered to death. And then her mom is removed from her life because her mom gets arrested, not because Fern said no more. And so this suggests that emotional wounds in this book are only addressed when the abuser is forcibly removed and not through any work that the survivor had to do. Like, Chet is arrested, her mom is arrested. Fern didn't have to, she didn't have to fight. She did, but she herself didn't have to fight. There was no one-on-one confrontation of like, no more. So acknowledged, yes, well done. Addressed, not really. Number 2 is justice achieved for those who have been wrong. Well, Chet does go to jail for attempted murder, and her mom goes to jail for attempted murder and I guess embezzlement. Fern dies, so she gets out of the death vow, and she does regain control over her own business. But this is legal justice. This is not any sort of emotional justice. So is justice achieved for those who have been wrong? I don't think so. I don't think so, not at all. And especially because courts in the United States are not set up to support victims. And like I said, if this was real life, Fern would have to go to multiple court hearings. She would have to constantly re-traumatize herself, reface her abusers. And I don't know, Chet would probably get like 6 months in community service before he's out walking again. Fern's mom probably will get a stiffer penance because she had a financial crime rather than a murder crime against a woman. Maybe that's me talking. In response to, is justice achieved for those who've been wrong? I'm going to say straight up no, especially not knowing how the legal battle is probably going to go. Question 3, are power balances meaningfully confronted and rectified? Confronted, yes. That's something I do find strange about this book, is Fern does repeatedly confront her mom. Yes, she just is like, Mom, okay, and she, like, at times she does try to pacify her mom, but it is weird that there are multiple times that she argues back and pushes back against her mom, which I think maybe is one of the reasons why I can't say that her emotional wounds were addressed. I think maybe it would have been more effective if we had seen Fern go from capitulating to her mom, maybe even questioning, oh, maybe I should let Chet back into my life. Maybe I have to do this. Maybe I have no other choice. I don't know what I can do. Maybe to where she is pretty early on in the book. I think, you know what, now that I'm saying it, a lot of the work that Fern needed to do probably happened when she was divorcing Chet. So what we're seeing is somebody who's halfway healed, healing maybe 10% more, because it was likely a lot more of a struggle to get the divorce than it was later on to just tell Chet no. So confronted, yeah, I'm gonna reframe that and say partially, because I think the confrontation happened 2 years ago during Fern's divorce, and that what we're seeing is the echoes of those confrontations that already started this. The only real confrontation that happens is around Fern's dyslexia and her owning that it's not something to be shamed, which is a power imbalance, because Fern's takes back her power by, one, recognizing it's not shameful, and two, by getting herself resources so she can start to read herself. That's how you rectify that situation, is you allow Fern to operate without help, external person help. And it'll be great when she does have external person help, but that she is not then kneecapped by not having Anu or Sarah there or her mom there. So our power imbalance is meaningfully confronted. 1. I'll give you a 0.5. So final question. Do characters grow in ways that promote emotional equity? Before I said what I just said a minute ago, I was going to say yes, Fern does. But when I made the connection that Fern probably did a lot of her growth 2 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago when she had to initially file for divorce, I think that that's the growth that we don't see in this book. What we see is Fern accepting some things, but she's already fought the hard battle. She's already done the hard things, and she's given herself a measure of freedom that she would not have had. She does gain a bit more community, but it's kind of community that she already had. Like the townspeople seem to like Fern. Like, I'm thinking about her cafe is super busy, so it's like community was already there. Even though she was isolated due to her dyslexia, it was very much like a self-imposed isolation. So maybe the growth is that she now sees she has community. There is emotional growth for self-acceptance, both on Fern's part and Anu's part, specifically around Anu liking to be submissive and accepting that even though he's an alpha, and Fern, for a variety of things, she's growing towards acceptance, even though Fern's is never like stamped by the end of the book. To tie this all up, to wrap this all up, to give you all your lives back, the central question is Audited by the Anubis an emotionally just book? No. I'm going to say no. I think that I actually didn't know what was going to come out of my mouth until I just said it. This happens every time. I think before I started recording the analysis, I was going to say yes. I think it is an emotionally just book, but at the end of the day, I think that it drops certain plot lines, such as Fern's fat phobia. I think that Fern, it doesn't get any sort of actual resolution with her mother. The fact that it ignores the fact she was shot in the chest, I'm never going to stop screaming that from the rooftops. I also do think that Anu should have been allowed to grow a little bit more. Now, what we have here is very much if an anxious attached person were to meet a securely attached person. Anu is the most securely attached puppy dog you could ever hope for, but shown as having zero issues with being a monster in a mostly human town. Can we just acknowledge the fact that Anu he's aware of people? What? Okay, hold on, I just thought about this. Yeah, no emotional justice at the end of this book. Because Anu talks about how he's used to being stared at, and if someone's open to it, he uses it as an opportunity to hopefully educate them. Right? And he does it with like a smile and a grin. And every marginalized racial identity that I know is like, yeah, we do it because we have to. We take the time to talk to people because majority of them aren't gonna actually hear what we say, but every once in a while, maybe we'll get through to someone and they'll grant us just a little bit more humanity. I mean, even the opening, his introduction, and he's thinking about like being a monster in the IRS and how some people think he's there to like kill them because he looks like a representative of a death god. We could have gotten a little bit more world weariness from Anu. We could have gotten a little bit more healing from him about Fern's just overwhelming acceptance. Like, Fern accepts him immediately. She's like, I love you. She wants to love him so bad. Fern's openness and willingness to accept him could have healed him as much as it healed her. But the complete and utter erasure of the experience of being other in a very uniform, homogenous population, never meaningfully addressed. And also, the only one that hates it is Chet and Fern's mom. And they talk about how, well, maybe if there were just more monsters around, the people of this town aren't bad. They just haven't interacted with your kind very much. And in reality, it's probably a sunset town. Yeah, so that's also a thing. Apologies to open up a can of worms right when I'm trying to close out the episode. Anu is not allowed full humanity. This is not an emotionally just book. Done. We're done. I could have made this. This episode is over 3 hours long. It could have been 30 seconds. Anu is not granted full humanity as yes, Fern is part Anubis, but she's passing. Nobody knows. She doesn't even know. Nobody can tell that she's Anubis. Nobody can tell that she's mixed. The marginalized individual in this book is just, he is not granted any form of humanity. This is not an emotionally just book. I'm glad that they're happily ever after. Oh, also, sorry, one more thing I didn't even touch on. Fern and Sarah have this great, amazing, Sarah also passing. And when she's not passing, she has to go live in the Vale now, which happens in her book. So she no longer is sticking around Cedar Peak Heights either. So Sarah's passing. But can we talk about how Fern loses every point of respect when at the end of the book she's like, ha ha ha, yeah, go ahead, kidnap Sarah, that's fine, Ender, even though she's just had this absolutely life-changing, horrific moment that has probably reopened all the wounds of having both of her parents die when she was a child, murdered by humans, by the way. Okay, this book is not emotionally just. The two monsters in the book get nothing. One gets kidnapped for last, the other one is one-dimensional. We're done. Thank you for okay, let me put back on my podcast Barbie. I call this podcast Barbie voice. Thank you for listening. I don't even have an outro. Audience, if you're hearing this, please comment to remind me to put together a proper outro for you.